The good news, you've spotted a unicorn. The bad news, it can only be caught by a virgin. It might eliminate you from life if it feels like it. And if you do somehow survive, some merchant is going to try to sell you its horn for the price of a small castle. Welcome to the medieval times where unicorns were real and common sense was in very short supply. Hello travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Imagine cracking open your Bible for some divine guidance, only to find a unicorn. No, not a metaphor for God's magical love, a literal unicorn. One horn, probably sparkly, probably neighing majestically as it gallops across the Holy Land. So how on earth did this happen? Let's start at the scene of the crime. Ancient translations. The original Hebrew Bible described a mysterious creature called the werent. Now no one's entirely sure what a werent was supposed to be, but most scholars think it was probably a wild ox, maybe an aurochs, a now extinct species of giant cow that looked like it could bench press a Roman legion. Big, scary, horned. Makes sense. But then came the Greek translators, who turned the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, the Septuagint, for the nerds keeping score at home. They looked at werent and thought, wild ox? Nah. Let's call it a monokoros. That means one-horned. Why? Maybe they thought the animal was being described from a dramatic side angle. Maybe they were just bored. Either way, suddenly, we have a one-horned beast in the text. Fast forward to the Latin Vulgate Bible. Saint Jerome, the guy responsible for this translation, inherited that monokeros from the Greeks. He could have looked at it and gone, hang on, this probably just means wild ox, but no, Jerome doubled down. Monokeros it remained. And because of this, by the time medieval Europeans were thumbing through their Bibles, they were reading about unicorns, like it was totally normal that God's greatest hits included a magical horse with a horn of death, and people believed it. After all, if it's in the Bible, it must be true, right? The unicorn became a creature not of fairy tales, but of holy scripture. Balsams, unicorns. Numbers, unicorns. Job, unicorns again. God's zoo, it seemed, was way cooler than any medieval menagerie. Forget lions and eagles. The Lord apparently kept unicorns on staff. And these weren't just cute, cuddly unicorns. The biblical unicorn was described as powerful, untamable, and strong. In fact, there's a verse in Numbers that says, God brought them out of Egypt. He hath, as it were, the strength of a unicorn. This wasn't some dainty pony prancing through meadows. This was a beast of raw divine muscle, the kind of animal you'd want on your side during a bar fight. Now you might be wondering, where exactly were all these biblical unicorns hanging out? Good question. Because here's the thing. No one in medieval Europe had seen one, but that didn't matter. The logic went, if the Bible says they exist, and we haven't seen one, that just means they live somewhere we haven't been yet. Looking at you, far-off lands of mystery. India, Africa, the next village over. And so the search began. Explorers and merchants claimed to spot unicorns in exotic places. Sometimes these unicorns turned out to be rhinoceroses, or oryxes, or literally anything with a horn that could be squinted at from the right angle. But the myth persisted, because scripture had spoken. And oh boy, then came the Ark Debate. Because if God created unicorns, what happened to them after the flood? Cue a medieval scholarly throwdown. Some claimed Noah definitely brought unicorns onto the ark. After all, wouldn't he want to save all of God's creatures? Others said, nope, the unicorns drowned. Why? Well, one popular theory was that unicorns were just too proud to board the ark. They stood on shore, flipping their manes, refusing to get on the boat with the regular animals. A flood? Please, they could swim, until you know they couldn't. One version of the story even had the unicorns swimming alongside the ark, playing and frolicking, until the waters rose too high, and splash, goodbye unicorns. Moral of the story, pride comes before a watery grave. And here's where it gets even more absurd. Some medieval writers tried to claim that the unicorns didn't drown at all. They were still out there, just hidden, because unicorns, you see, were smart enough to avoid nosy humans. That's why no one could find them anymore. Not because they were mythical. No, because they were elusive. So to sum up, thanks to a little translation slip, or poetic flourish, depending how generous you're feeling, an ordinary wild ox morphed into a one-horned wonder in the Bible. Medieval people didn't see this as a fable or symbol. To them, unicorns were as real as lions, tigers, and bears. Oh my. They believed these beasts roamed distant lands, starred in God's plan, and maybe, just maybe, could still be out there, if you knew where to look. And the best part? This belief wasn't just harmless fun. It fueled centuries of unicorn hunts, art, medicine, and royal bling. But more on that in the next chapters. If you lived in the Middle Ages and wanted to learn about animals, you didn't grab a field guide or pop onto Wikipedia, because witchcraft. No, you cracked open a bestiary, a glorious hand-copied book where science, religious metaphor, and total fantasy threw a raucous party together. These books were supposed to help people understand the world. What they actually did was blend natural history with the kind of storytelling that would make a modern conspiracy theorist proud. And guess what creature strutted through these pages like it owned the place? That's right, the unicorn. To a medieval reader, bestiaries were as close as you could get to National Geographic. They contained detailed descriptions of animals, helpful moral lessons, and of course, lovingly hand-painted illustrations. Lions, elephants, crocodiles, all there. But sandwiched between these legitimate creatures, unicorns, drawn and described with the same scholarly confidence as anything else, as if the authors had personally shared a beer with one. The best part? These weren't some fringe doodles scribbled in the margins. Monks and scholars seriously included unicorns in their bestiaries as factual, God-created beasts. You could flip from a page about, say, the hunting habits of a wolf, to a section that earnestly explained how to capture a unicorn. Spoiler, it's weird, and involves virgins. More on that in another chapter. To the medieval mind, there was no separation between reality and myth, if the myth came with a moral attached, and boy did unicorns come with baggage. The typical bestiary description of a unicorn went something like this: a small animal, resembling a horse or goat, with a single horn projecting from its forehead. Shy and fierce, it cannot be captured by force, but when a pure virgin sits before it, the unicorn will lay its head in her lap, and thus be taken. Let's break that down. It's basically a weaponized pony that can only be outwitted by virtue. A horse-shaped medieval security system, if you will. Shy as a deer, deadly as a sword, apparently into virgins. Medieval people read this, and nodded along like it made perfect sense. And oh, the illustrations. If you ever get the chance to flip through a digitized bestiary, do it. You'll thank me. Unicorns appear in all kinds of shapes and sizes, because monks weren't exactly working from photos. Some look like dainty little ponies with delicate spiral horns. Others are weird goat-horse hybrids with murderous eyes. There's one famous bestiary where the unicorn looks like someone tried to draw a horse from memory. After one too many flagons of ale. Tiny legs, sad little tail, horn that could double as a medieval drill bit. The confidence, though, you can almost hear the monk muttering, "Yes, this is what they look like." Definitely. And let's not forget the moral angle, because in the Middle Ages, animals weren't just animals, they were symbols. Lions stood for Christ's power. Pelicans, yes, pelicans were said to represent sacrifice, because people thought they pecked their own chests to feed their young with blood. And unicorns. Oh, unicorns were basically a four-legged purity test. They symbolized Christ, or the Virgin Mary, or purity itself. Sometimes all three at once in a tangle of metaphor that would make a modern English teacher weep. The unicorn resting its head in a virgin's lap, that was supposed to represent the incarnation, God entering the world through the Virgin Mary. Subtlety was not a medieval strong suit, and because these books were hand-copied by monks who believed they were passing down sacred knowledge, no one stopped to say, "Hey, has anyone actually seen one of these things?" They just kept illustrating and describing them with the same certainty they described lions prowling the Holy Land. After all, who were you to question the wisdom of centuries of church tradition? The bestiary said unicorns existed, and that was that. In some bestiaries, the unicorn's horn wasn't just decorative. Oh no, this bad boy had magical properties. It could purify poisoned water, cure disease, and even detect treachery. According to these accounts, kings would buy so-called unicorn horns, really narwhal tusks. But hey, details. and display them like the medieval equivalent of a flex. Imagine being so rich you could stir your wine with a unicorn horn and not die from poisoning. Talk about luxury. In short, bestiaries were like medieval science textbooks, co-written by David Attenborough and a very imaginative monk who hadn't seen daylight in 10 years. Unicorns weren't fantasy, they were part of the natural order, right alongside animals you could actually trip over. And if no one had seen one, that just proved how rare and special they were. So next time someone tells you people in the Middle Ages were simple, remember this. They weren't gullible. They just lived in a world where fact, faith, and fan fiction galloped together across the page, horn first. Picture this. You're a nobleman in medieval Europe. You've got a castle, a questionable haircut, and a deep, burning desire to own a unicorn. Why? Maybe to show off, maybe to prove your piety, or maybe because everyone else at court claims they've seen one, and you're not about to be left out. But there's a problem. Unicorns aren't like deer or boars. You can't just chase one down with a pack of dogs and a pointy stick. Oh no. Hunting a unicorn required something far rarer than skill or courage. A virgin. That's right. According to the wisdom of the time, unicorns had one very specific weakness. Pure maidens. Supposedly, these magical beasts, otherwise fierce, untamable, and capable of goring a knight through his chainmail like it was butter, would go completely soft at the sight of a virgin. The idea was that the unicorn, upon spotting a maiden of perfect virtue, would trot over, lay its head in her lap, and fall asleep in blissful trust. And that's when the lurking hunters, hiding behind trees like the world's most awkward fan club, would leap out and stab it. Chivalry, ladies and gentlemen. Where did this bizarre strategy come from? Well, as with most medieval ideas, it was a mix of half-remembered folklore, church sermons, and moral symbolism run amok. In this case, it was also fueled by the bestiary tradition we covered earlier. The unicorn wasn't just an animal, it was a walking metaphor for purity. And what better to ensnare purity than, well, more purity? A unicorn, they reasoned, could only be captured by someone as spotless and sinless as itself. Naturally, this meant maidens were roped into what must have been the strangest hunting expeditions in history. And let's talk about the art, because medieval artists really ran with this concept. There are tapestries, illuminated manuscripts, and paintings galore showing the virgin unicorn encounter. And let me tell you, the vibe is weird. Imagine a serene-looking young woman sitting beneath a tree, often with a book in hand, like she's trying to pretend this is totally normal. The unicorn approaches, its spiral horn gleaming, and rests its head in her lap, as if asking for a bedtime story. Meanwhile, lurking in the background, a bunch of men, usually dressed in hunting garb, peeking out from behind trees and rocks, clutching spears or swords, waiting for the exact moment to ruin the unicorn's nap. It's like a mashup of a nature documentary and a horror film, with a heavy dose of awkward. To modern eyes, these images look hilariously strange, but to a medieval viewer, they were loaded with symbolism. The maiden represented the Virgin Mary, because of course, everything circled back to theology. The unicorn represented Christ, coming willingly to its fate. The hunters, well, depending on who was doing the sermonizing, they could represent the forces of evil, sin, or sometimes just the cruel world. The whole scene was basically an illustrated lesson in Christian purity, sacrifice, and the dangers of moral corruption, all wrapped up in the image of a magical beast getting duped by a girl sitting under a tree. But let's pause for a moment and think about how this actually worked in practice. Imagine you're that virgin. Your job is to wander out into the forest, unarmed, and sit there while hoping that a unicorn shows up. It doesn't decide today's the day to go rogue, and see your fellow hunters don't accidentally spear you in the chaos. And who's verifying your purity status? We're not exactly talking about a rigorous application process here. The whole thing smacks of an idea cooked up by people who had never once set foot in an actual forest. Of course, the unicorn hunt was rarely, if ever, about actually catching anything. These hunts were largely symbolic, performed in stories, art, and pageants, rather than real life. There are no records of anyone successfully bagging a unicorn, despite the best efforts of maiden-baiting nobles across Europe. What mattered wasn't the outcome, but the idea. Purity conquers the wild, virtue tames the untamable, and well, Virgins are useful for more than just royal marriage alliances, and it gets better, or worse, depending on your sense of humour. Some accounts claimed that the unicorn would not only lay its head in the virgin's lap, but fall asleep entirely, overcome by the sheer force of her innocence. This gave the hunters all the time they needed to sneak up and do the deed. Talk about trusting the wrong crowd. The unicorn's big fatal flaw wasn't its horn or its temper. It was apparently being an absolute sucker for a wholesome vibe. Unicorn hunting became such a big deal in medieval culture that it even showed up in royal emblems and coats of arms. The idea of taming a unicorn with virtue was so popular that Scotland eventually adopted the unicorn as a national symbol, chained unicorns, no less, because nothing says we're fierce and independent, quite like a magical horse who was tricked by a virgin and then chained up forever. In the end, unicorn hunting was less about catching mythical creatures and more about selling an ideal. It told people that the wild and dangerous could be subdued by goodness, that innocence had power, and that if you just had the right bait, you could control the uncontrollable. A lovely thought, if you ignored the fact that the unicorn always ended up dead. Ah, unicorns. Majestic, magical, mythical, and apparently highly profitable. Because as it turns out, while no one ever actually caught a unicorn, that didn't stop people in the Middle Ages from building an entire economy around their most prized body part, the horn. And what a racket it was. If you had a unicorn horn in your possession, congratulations. You were either filthy rich, extremely gullible, or both. Probably both. Let's start with the basics. In the grand tradition of medieval science, which, as we've established, was about 60% wishful thinking, 30% church doctrine, and 10% best not to ask, unicorn horns were believed to be objects of immense power. These spiral ivory wonders weren't just trophies. They were said to neutralize poison, cure disease, detect treachery, and generally make you the envy of all your friends at royal banquets. Picture it: a king raising his goblet, dipping a unicorn horn into his wine to check for toxins, and nodding solemnly. Good news, no poison. Bad news, you still have to drink medieval wine, which may or may not contain bits of dirt, lead, and yesterday's fish. So where did these miraculous horns come from, you ask? Since the actual unicorn population was, shall we say, lacking, enter the narwhal, nature's most accidental con artist. Narwhals, those Arctic-dwelling whales with long spiral tusks, were the real heroes of the unicorn horn trade. Scandinavian traders and clever seafarers realized that no one in medieval Europe had any idea what a narwhal was. So when they turned up at market with a massive spiral tusk and said, "Behold, a unicorn horn," people didn't ask questions. They just handed over gold. And I do mean gold. Genuine unicorn horns were worth literal fortunes. A single tusk could sell for the equivalent of millions of dollars today. Monarchs competed to collect them like they were the Pokemon cards of the Renaissance. Queen Elizabeth I reportedly owned one valued at £10,000, an absurd sum at the time. Pope Clement VII had one too, just in case God needed a little extra backup when it came to detecting poison at dinner. And no self-respecting noble would host a feast without proudly displaying his unicorn horn, as both a conversation piece and a supposed guarantee that the wine wouldn't kill you. But why the obsession with poison? Well, in medieval and Renaissance courts, getting offed by a rival's sneaky cup of poison was a real occupational hazard. Kings, queens, dukes, they all lived in constant fear that their next sip of mead might be their last. And here comes the unicorn horn, promising to save the day. Allegedly, if you dipped one in a cup laced with poison, it would either change colour, fizz, sweat, or neutralize the toxins outright. What it usually did was nothing at all. But hey, the placebo effect is a powerful thing. Of course, it wasn't just kings and popes falling for this. Wealthy merchants, bishops, and even universities invested in unicorn horn specimens. The grandest collectors would display these tusks in cabinets of curiosities, alongside other exotic oddities: shrunken heads, bezoar stones, mermaid skeletons, aka dried fish with glued-on monkey parts. It was like the original Ripley's Believe It or Not, but with more incense. And let's not forget the medical side of the unicorn horn hustle. Apothecaries would grind these tusks into powder to sell as an all-purpose cure. Headache? Unicorn horn. Fever? Unicorn horn. Plague? Why not sprinkle some unicorn horn on it for good measure? We even have records of unicorn horn being incorporated into the materials of royal drinking vessels. Because what's safer than a unicorn horn-lined cup? Spoiler, lots of things, including just not drinking the sketchy wine. Now, was there anyone who smelled something fishy? Other than the narwhals, occasionally, a few skeptics began to raise eyebrows, especially as global exploration revealed new animals and the narwhal's secret identity started leaking out. But for the most part, the myth held strong well into the Renaissance. After all, if you're a king who just dropped a small fortune on a fancy stick, are you really going to admit it's just whale teeth? Probably not. You're going to double down and tell everyone that your unicorn horn just saved you from a deadly assassination plot. Because that's what good PR looks like. By the 17th century, the unicorn horn trade finally began to fade as scientific inquiry and basic common sense started gaining ground. But the damage had been done. The narwhal, minding its own business in Arctic waters, had been dragged into centuries of unicorn-related nonsense, all because some medieval merchant realized that no one in Europe had ever seen a whale with a tusk before. So next time you see a picture of a king proudly holding a unicorn horn or a museum display of a spiral relic, remember, behind that symbol of purity and magic was probably just a confused narwhal who lost its tooth, and a merchant who made a very tidy profit. Picture this. You're a medieval knight. Your armor shines in the sun. Your horse is the medieval equivalent of a sports car, and your hair is doing that windswept thing that looks great in tapestries. But wait, how do you really prove to the world that you're the ultimate package of bravery, nobility, and unattainable romantic longing? Simple. You slap a unicorn on your shield, your banner, your family crest, and maybe even your underpants, because nothing says chivalry quite like a magical pointy-headed horse that probably doesn't exist. Yes, friends, welcome to the bizarre but oh-so-fashionable world where unicorns became the official mascot of knights who wanted to look virtuous, powerful, and just a little mysterious. Let's break this down. During the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, the concept of chivalry wasn't just about being good at sword fights. It was a complex code of conduct that mixed martial prowess, loyalty, religious devotion, and the kind of awkward courtly love that mostly involved sighing at ladies from across the room and writing bad poetry. Knights weren't just warriors, they were supposed to be paragons of moral virtue, and what better animal to represent that than the unicorn? After all, this was a creature said to be pure, untamable, and basically allergic to sin. The unicorn became the perfect symbol of a knight's ideal self. Noble, noble, and more noble. Now, if you're imagining knights galloping into battle with unicorn stickers on their helmets, you're not entirely wrong. Heraldry, that colourful language of coats of arms, shields, and banners, became absolutely saturated with unicorns. These weren't the glittery, rainbow-farting unicorns of today's cartoons. Medieval unicorns looked serious. They were often drawn as muscular, fierce beasts with the body of a horse, the hooves of a goat, and sometimes a lion's tail. Because, why not? The horn, of course, was always long, sharp, and very pointy. Just the thing to add a bit of don't mess with me energy to your family crest. And let's talk about those crests. When a noble house added a unicorn to its coat of arms, it was essentially announcing, "Behold, we are pure of heart, righteous in cause, and totally not overcompensating for anything." The unicorn came to stand for strength, tempered by virtue, wildness, subdued by moral superiority, which is a fancy way of saying it made your family look good at parties. The more unicorns on your banners, the more you were telling the world, we're classy, we're godly. Also, we definitely didn't bribe our way into this title. How dare you? This unicorn obsession wasn't limited to shields and banners. Knights and nobles plastered unicorns everywhere, in tapestries, on seals, carved into the woodwork of their great halls, embroidered onto capes, and even engraved onto sword hilts. If you could put a unicorn on it, someone did. It was the medieval version of slapping a luxury brand logo on all your belongings. Because nothing says respect me quite like wielding a sword that implies you're as virtuous as a mythical horse-goat lion with a deadly forehead spike. Of course, the unicorn wasn't just about personal branding. It also got tangled up with the whole mess of courtly love. If you were a knight, longing for an unattainable lady, which was frankly most nights at any given time. The unicorn was the perfect symbol for your feelings. Just like a unicorn could only be tamed by a pure maiden, so too was the knight's heart, tamed only by the gaze of his lady. Preferably from a safe distance, because actually talking to her was terrifying. You can almost hear the lute music now. And let's not forget the unicorn's starring role in those famous medieval tapestries. The most famous example, The Hunt of the Unicorn, is basically the Middle Ages version of a blockbuster miniseries, knights and noblemen chasing the elusive beast. The unicorn, eventually captured thanks to the inevitable pure maiden. And finally, the creature brought back in triumph. These tapestries were draped in castles and manors as status symbols, but they were also loaded with symbolism about love, purity, sacrifice. And let's be honest, a fair bit of showing off. Oh, this old thing, a lord might say, gesturing at the 6-panel masterpiece covering half his hall. Just a little something to remind us of virtue, chivalry, and our immense wealth. But underneath all that symbolic grandeur was a subtle hint of insecurity. After all, if you felt completely secure in your family's nobility, would you really need to cover everything in unicorns? Maybe, maybe not. But in a world where lineage, honor, and reputation were everything, plastering your belongings with unicorns was a way of loudly declaring your chivalric credentials, whether or not reality matched the branding. In the end, unicorns became woven into the very fabric of knightly identity, fierce yet pure, wild yet virtuous. The unicorn was the perfect fantasy creature for a class of men who wanted to believe they were just as special, whether that belief held up in actual battles or real romances. Well, let's just say it looked great on a shield. Ah, the Middle Ages. A time when medical science was mostly guesswork, prayer, and whatever powders your local apothecary could scrape off the back of a passing animal. And in this grand tradition of try it, and see if you die slower, unicorn horn was considered the ultimate medieval miracle cure. Never mind that no one had ever actually seen a unicorn in the wild. That didn't stop anyone from believing that ground-up horn dust could cure everything from the plague to, well, bad vibes. Let's set the scene. Imagine you're a medieval noble. You wake up feeling a bit off. Maybe it's the bubonic plague. Maybe it's just last night's questionable mutton. Either way, your doctor shows up with a solution, a pinch of unicorn horn powder, because obviously, nothing says effective medicine like sprinkling imaginary horse horn dust into your goblet of wine. Unicorn horn, or what people thought was unicorn horn, was sold as the cure for just about every ailment under the medieval sun. Got a fever? Unicorn horn. Epilepsy? Unicorn horn. Poisoned by your political rivals? Unicorn horn. Feeling like Saturn is in a bad position and cursing your health? You guessed it. Unicorn horn. It was the medieval equivalent of coconut oil, or essential oils today. Just fancier, rarer, and a lot more expensive. And yes, it supposedly fixed bad air and evil humors, because nothing gets rid of invisible threats like sprinkling magical dust on them. Now, where did all these unicorn horns come from? You might think, surely someone eventually noticed that unicorns weren't exactly roaming the European countryside. But medieval merchants were nothing if not resourceful. Enter the narwhal. That's right. Those pointy-headed whales from the Arctic unknowingly funded an entire medical industry. Viking traders and enterprising northerners would sell narwhal tusks to European nobles, labeling them as genuine unicorn horns. And since no one had ever seen a narwhal either, the deception worked like a charm. These tusks didn't come cheap. A single narwhal tusk could be worth its weight in gold, sometimes more. Kings, queens, popes, and the rich nobility were eager to get their hands on unicorn horn. Having one wasn't just about health insurance, it was about showing off. Displaying a unicorn horn in your home was the ultimate status symbol. It said, "Look at me, I'm rich enough to own this magical beast's body part, and also, I will probably live forever because of it." Spoiler, they didn't. But owning a unicorn horn wasn't enough. You had to use it. Often, the tusk would be ground down into powder, mixed into wine or water, and drunk as a cure or preventative measure. If you were worried about poison, which was a very legitimate concern in the backstabbing world of medieval politics, you could even stir your drink with a unicorn horn. The belief was that if your goblet contained poison, the unicorn horn would neutralize it. So yes, royal banquets often featured people dramatically waving what was essentially a giant whale tooth over their cups before taking a sip. medieval science at its finest. And the medical claims didn't stop at poison. Unicorn horn powder was said to cure plague, because of course it was. When the Black Death came knocking, people were willing to try anything. A few shavings of unicorn horn might cost you a fortune, but when your other options were leeches or dying in a ditch, it seemed like a good investment. If nothing else, at least you died knowing you had the best imaginary medicine money could buy. Even outside of plague wards and royal courts, unicorn horn made its way into apothecary shops, sold in tiny quantities for those who couldn't afford a whole tusk. It might be mixed with other herbs or ground stones, turned into potions, or added to salves. It was basically medieval snake oil, but with a lot more prestige and a lot more narwhal. The funny or tragic part is none of it worked. Drinking unicorn horn powder didn't stop poison. It didn't cure epilepsy. It didn't drive off the plague. The only thing it definitely cured was the weight of your wallet, which became considerably lighter after every purchase. But in a world where medicine was more about hope than science, unicorn horn was irresistible. It was exotic, expensive, and promised salvation. That was more than enough. Oh, and about those side effects. Beyond emptying your coffers, probably none, unless you count accidentally ingesting whatever mystery substances unscrupulous traders might have mixed into your unicorn powder. But hey, at least your heirs could inherit your splendid narwhal tusk, display it in the Great Hall, and continue the grand tradition of believing in magical cures that did absolutely nothing. In the end, the medical use of unicorn stuff was a perfect reflection of medieval life, a blend of desperation, superstition, and showmanship. Because if you're going to get sick, you might as well do it in style, with a goblet of unicorn-laced wine in hand. If you've ever gazed at the royal coat of arms of the United Kingdom and thought, why is there a horse with a fencing sword growing out of its forehead next to that lion? Congratulations, you've spotted one of the most curious, enduring symbols of Scottish identity, the unicorn. That's right, in a world where kingdoms usually picked lions, bears, or at least animals that actually existed, Scotland proudly chose a mythical beast as its national animal. And not just any mythical beast, a unicorn, because why settle for reality when you can claim allegiance to a horned, untamable symbol of freedom? Let's gallop back through history to see how this came about. The roots of Scotland's unicorn obsession go deep, centuries deep, in fact. By the 12th century, unicorns were already appearing in royal seals and banners, long before England thought to put them on joint arms. The unicorn wasn't just a random pick. In medieval symbolism, this pointy-headed wonder represented qualities that Scots valued above all: fierce independence, strength, purity of cause, and the kind of stubbornness that makes people build castles on cliffs, just to make invasion inconvenient. See, the unicorn in Scottish heraldry wasn't portrayed as a dainty, frolicking creature. It was often depicted as wild, muscular, with a twisted horn sharp enough to skewer your average English knight's ego. And crucially, the unicorn was always shown chained, not because Scots wanted to imprison it. Quite the opposite. The chain symbolized that even this most untamable of creatures could only be subdued by the rightful King of Scotland. It was a flex, pure and simple. Look at this beast that no one else can control, except us. By the time of King James I of Scotland in the 15th century, unicorns had become a regular fixture on royal coats of arms. When James VI of Scotland also became James I of England in 1603, he merged the English lion and the Scottish unicorn onto the royal arms, creating one of the most entertainingly mismatched duos in heraldic history. The lion, symbol of England, stands for brute strength, kingly authority, and a tendency to roar at things. The unicorn, freedom, mystery, and the noble refusal to be conquered, unless of course you happen to be a Scottish monarch. The result is a coat of arms that looks like the opening credits of the weirdest buddy cop movie you've ever seen. But why did the Scots latch onto the unicorn so fiercely? The answer lies in the unicorn's symbolic qualities, which read like a checklist of national aspirations. First, the unicorn was legendary for being impossible to capture. You could try, many did, in stories at least, but it always eluded hunters unless it chose to be caught. What better emblem for a nation that prided itself on defying invaders and maintaining its sovereignty against overwhelming odds? The unicorn's untamable nature mirrored Scotland's own history, small, fierce, and determined to stay free, no matter how many times larger neighbours tried to muscle in. Then there's the unicorn's famous strength. Medieval texts often described unicorns as able to gore elephants to death with their horns, which, considering neither creature roamed the highlands, made for some excellent barroom storytelling material. The point was clear. The unicorn might look elegant, but it packed a punch. It was both beautiful and deadly, much like the Scottish landscape itself, breathtaking to behold, but try crossing it unprepared, and you'd be sorry. And let's not forget the unicorn's purity. In a land where kings often claimed divine right to rule, the unicorn reinforced the idea that Scotland's monarchs weren't just strong, they were righteous. The unicorn's association with virtue and incorruptibility made it the perfect sidekick for any king trying to bolster his moral credentials. After all, if your royal crest features a symbol of absolute goodness and power, that's got to reflect well on you, right? Even today, long after the thrones of Scotland and England merged, the unicorn remains proudly enshrined in Scottish identity. It appears not only on the royal coat of arms but on coins, government buildings, and souvenirs ranging from respectable monuments to questionable fridge magnets. And while England's lion stands free, the Scottish unicorn is still shown with its chain, a reminder of its once fierce independence, now part of a shared monarchy, but never forgotten. Some might say it's odd to choose an imaginary animal to represent your national character, but if you ask a Scot why the unicorn is their symbol, they might just smile and say, because it stands for everything that can't be conquered, no matter how hard the world tries, and if that means embracing a creature that only exists in legend, all the better. After all, reality is overrated when you can have a unicorn. Before there was Dungeons and Dragons, before teenage bedrooms were plastered with posters of dragons and wizards, before fantasy novels filled bookstores, there was medieval unicorn fan art. And oh boy, did the nobles go all in. If you were rich in medieval Europe, like really rich, you didn't just commission a boring old portrait or a tapestry of your family tree. No, that was peasant stuff. You had unicorns galloping across your castle walls, immortalized in intricate, shimmering tapestries so enormous they could double as draft stoppers for your drafty stone hallways. And while these artworks were meant to signal sophistication, purity, and deep spiritual meaning, they often ended up looking more like a scene from a medieval horror movie, directed by someone who'd never seen a unicorn, or for that matter, a horse. Let's start with the most famous of these glorious textile tributes, the Hunt of the Unicorn tapestries. This series, woven in the late 15th century, probably in Brussels, was the unicorn fandom equivalent of buying the entire deluxe collector's edition box set. 7 massive panels depict what can only be described as the most beautiful, confusing, and oddly brutal unicorn narrative ever put on wool and silk. Picture it: rich reds, deep greens, delicate gold threads. The scenes are packed with knights, hounds, forests, and of course, the unicorn itself, prancing, fighting, bleeding dramatically, and eventually captured and killed. Well, kind of killed. In the last panel, the unicorn somehow ends up alive again, chilling inside a fancy enclosure like it's moved into a medieval petting zoo. Art historians still debate what this means. Maybe it symbolizes Christ's death and resurrection. Maybe it represents love tamed by marriage. Or maybe the artist just got tired of drawing blood. And speaking of blood, these tapestries are gory. The unicorn gets speared repeatedly, chased by dogs, and ultimately hemmed in by noble hunters who look very pleased with themselves. This wasn't your cuddly Lisa Frank-style unicorn. This was a wild, dangerous beast, brought low by human cunning and pointy sticks. Yet, despite the unicorn's violent demise, the scenes were meant to evoke deeper, high-minded ideals, the triumph of virtue over wildness, or divine love overcoming sin, or possibly just, look how rich I am. I can afford a tapestry bigger than your barn. That brings us to the real reason. Castles were stuffed to the rafters with unicorn art, status flexing. A unicorn tapestry wasn't just decoration, it was like putting a Ferrari in your front yard. Except your Ferrari was made of thousands of hand-woven threads and took years to create. These tapestries were staggeringly expensive. The materials alone, silk, silver, gold thread, cost a fortune. And the labor? You were paying entire teams of master weavers to sit there day after day, weaving your mythical beast, while probably wondering if they'd ever get to work on a nice floral pattern instead. Unicorns also appeared in stained glass, illuminated manuscripts, carved furniture, and even on the odd goblet or jewelry box. Because nothing says class like drinking your wine from a cup decorated with a bleeding unicorn. And while the official explanation was that unicorns symbolized purity, chastity, and all those other lofty Christian virtues, let's be real, nobles wanted unicorn art because it showed they had taste, education, and the kind of disposable income that let them drop a year's worth of peasants' wages on a wall hanging. But here's where it gets funny. The unicorns in these artworks often look, well, off. Medieval artists weren't exactly working from life models, so their unicorns ranged from reasonably horse-like to that goat has an ice cream cone glued to its head. Some had cloven hooves, others lion tails, some tiny dainty bodies paired with massive spiraling horns that seemed more dangerous to the unicorn itself than to any predator. And because perspective was still a work in progress in medieval art, the scale could get comical. A unicorn might look smaller than a hunting dog, or the same size as the tree it's standing under. It's like the artists asked, "What does a unicorn look like?" And everyone answered, yes. The tapestries weren't just wall decor, either. They served practical purposes. Hanging thick textiles helped insulate those drafty stone castles. So when you admired a unicorn being dramatically stabbed in the heart, you were also staying a bit warmer. Nothing like violence against imaginary creatures to ward off a chill. Over time, these unicorn images took on a kind of legendary status of their own. The tapestries became prized heirlooms, passed down through generations of noble families. Today, the hunt of the unicorn tapestries reside in the Cloisters Museum in New York, where visitors can admire them up close and marvel at the sheer effort it took to immortalize a beast no one had ever seen, and probably didn't believe in all that much either. In the end, unicorn art in the Middle Ages wasn't just about unicorns. It was about identity, wealth, religion, and a touch of fantasy that made castle life just a little more magical, or at least a little less cold. So next time you see a unicorn tapestry, remember, that's not just fan art, that's medieval bling. Now imagine, for a moment, you're a medieval merchant. You've got bills to pay, ships to maintain, and a very inconvenient habit of gambling your profits away at the local tavern. Then, one day, inspiration strikes. You look at a pile of odd-looking animal parts and think, why not sell these to some rich fool as unicorn relics? And just like that, a thriving business in unicorn fraud is born. Welcome to the golden age of unicorn-related swindling, when clever merchants, traders, and outright con artists made bank selling fake unicorn horns, skins and bones to kings, queens, and anyone else with more gold than sense. In a world where science was still figuring out basic facts like maybe don't bleed patients for every illness, telling a noble that your pointy stick came from a magical horse, goat, deer thing was basically a license to print money. The most famous and most lucrative item in this scamfest, the unicorn horn, or, as we in the 21st century call it, a narwhal tusk. These long, spiraled ivory spears were brought in from the Arctic by Scandinavian traders, who either didn't know or didn't care that they were fueling the great unicorn myth. They sold these tusks to European merchants, who then marked them up like medieval car dealers, selling a one-owner chariot, and the prices were insane. A single unicorn horn could fetch a sum equivalent to a small fortune, enough to buy land titles or a really nice castle with extra tapestry space. Royals couldn't get enough of them. The Danish king, the French monarchy, even the Pope himself, all proudly displayed their unicorn horns like medieval bling, convinced they could detect poison, cure disease, or at the very least impress visiting dignitaries. But narwhal tusks weren't the only things passed off as unicorn parts. Oh no. The creativity of medieval con artists knew no bounds. One enterprising merchant famously tried to pass off a rhinoceros horn as a unicorn relic. There was just one small problem. Rhino horns aren't spiral-shaped. Did that stop our innovative fraudster? Not a chance. He simply filed it down into a spiral. Voila. Instant unicorn horn. Some assembly and sanding required. And it worked. The noble who bought it was none the wiser, proudly displaying their new treasure as proof of their refined taste and mystical connections. Then there were the so-called unicorn skins. What were these actually made from? It varied. Sometimes they were from exotic animals, like antelope or deer, tanned and dyed to look a bit more magical. Other times they were literally patched together from scraps of fur that could have come off your neighbor's livestock. But add a good backstory. This was taken from a unicorn slain by the Duke of Fancyshire on a pilgrimage, and suddenly it was worth a small kingdom's ransom. Bones? Merchants didn't even try very hard. They'd grab whatever large, weird-looking bones they could find. Whale bones, mammoth remains dug up in farmlands, or just an unusually shaped cow femur, and sell them as authentic unicorn relics. The beauty of unicorn bones was that no one actually knew what they were supposed to look like, so it was hard to call out the fraud. What makes all of this even funnier is how serious people were about it. Entire inventories were kept of royal unicorn relic collections. Courts would display them during ceremonies. Unicorn horns were ground into powder for medicine, kept in royal treasuries as talismans against poison, and even worked into crown jewels. Some nobles would dip the tip of the horn into their wine as a poison test, because apparently the unicorn's magical vibes would neutralize any toxins. The good news, their wine wasn't poisoned. The bad news, they were still drinking medieval wine, which was its own kind of punishment. And let's not forget the merchants themselves, who became legendary for their ability to talk up their wares. These weren't just salesmen, they were storytellers. With enough flair, a weathered old tusk became a sacred relic wrested from a unicorn after a holy hunt in the forests of far-off lands. That weird bone, proof of the beast's mighty stature. That patchy piece of fur. A unicorn pelt, of course. You couldn't just buy a thing, you bought the legend that came with it. In the end, the unicorn trade was one big game of let's see how much nobles will believe. And to the merchants' credit, they played it brilliantly. They fueled the myth of the unicorn, made a fortune doing it, and left behind a legacy of fraud so colourful that it still makes historians chuckle today. So next time you hear about someone falling for a too-good-to-be-true deal, just remember, medieval nobles bought unicorn parts from guys who probably couldn't have identified a real horse on a bet. Some things, it seems, never change. By the time the Renaissance rolled around, humanity was finally starting to ask important questions, like, what if unicorns aren't real? This was a period where people were busy rediscovering ancient Greek texts, charting new continents, and importantly, inventing the scientific method. Unfortunately for unicorns, this new habit of checking facts wasn't great for their public relations. Up until this point, the unicorn had enjoyed an absolutely charmed existence in the European imagination. It had been a symbol of purity, nobility, divine power, and let's face it, gullibility. But as explorers set out across the globe, they noticed something odd. Despite tromping through jungles, deserts, and uncharted forests, nobody was actually finding unicorns. You'd think at least one knight or sailor would have bumped into one while looking for spices or gold. But no. The unicorn continued to be as elusive as a nobleman's promise. Early skeptics began to poke holes in the whole unicorn narrative. Renaissance naturalists like Conrad Gessner and Elisée Aldrovandi started cataloguing actual animals, and they had bad news. Narwhal tusks, rhino horns and weird bones didn't add up to a magical horse-goat hybrid. Even Marco Polo, a man famous for describing wonders, had returned from his travels with nothing more unicorny than a disappointed glance at some rhinos. His verdict: ugly brutes, so much for the majestic creature of legend. But oh, the excuses people made as the unicorn's reputation crumbled. One popular theory was that unicorns were simply too shy to be seen. You see, they weren't not real, they were just experts at social distancing. Honestly, if they were around today, they'd be celebrated as champions of avoiding awkward small talk. Others claimed that unicorns had once roamed the earth freely, but humanity's greed and violence had driven them to extinction. That's right. We managed to wipe out an animal that may never have existed in the first place. Bravo, us. Some theorists, desperate to salvage the myth, proposed that unicorns lived in such remote and dangerous corners of the world that no explorer had ever reached them. Perhaps they dwelled on mountaintops higher than any man could climb, or in valleys shrouded in mist and mystery. Sure, no one had seen them, but absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, right? That's the same logic people use today to justify Bigfoot documentaries. Meanwhile, collectors started quietly retiring their unicorn relics. That priceless horn, maybe don't display it quite so proudly. Now that everyone knows it's from a narwhal, those bones, just move them to the back of the cabinet, behind the less embarrassing items, like your collection of medieval snake oils. But here's the twist. While unicorns were dying a slow death in scientific circles, They were being reborn in culture. The Renaissance may have killed belief in actual unicorns, but it helped unicorns evolve into something arguably even more powerful. A symbol. Unicorns became stand-ins for all sorts of lofty ideals. Untouchable beauty, freedom, purity, even defiance. Take Scotland, for instance, where the unicorn remains a national symbol to this day. Why? Because nothing screams "don't mess with us" quite like an imaginary creature that can only be caught by virgins, and will impale you if you try. And from there, the unicorn just kept trotting into our collective imagination. By the 18th century, they'd gone from being a serious part of bestiaries to charming subjects in children's books. By the 20th century, they were the stuff of toys, cartoons, and sparkly stationery. Today, unicorns are everywhere, on coffee mugs, t-shirts, and Instagram filters. They've become a sort of catch-all symbol for whimsy, magic, and that unshakable human desire to believe in the fantastical, no matter how much evidence piles up against it. In a way, the unicorn is the perfect mascot for humanity's endless hope. We want magic to be real. We want the impossible to be possible. So even though explorers, scientists, and skeptics dragged the unicorn from its mythical pedestal, we quietly put it back up there, this time surrounded by rainbows, glitter, and internet memes. So the next time you see a unicorn plushie or a neon unicorn pool float, remember, that's the ghost of an ancient legend. A creature that once occupied the pages of bestiaries and the halls of kings, now reincarnated as a symbol of everything that's fun, fantastical, and delightfully unrealistic. The unicorn may not have survived the Renaissance, but it's thriving in the age of pop culture, and honestly, that's kind of magical in itself. Now let's talk about the Colosseum. Picture this. It's 70 CE. Rome is recovering from one of the biggest dumpster fires in its history, Nero's reign. You remember Nero, the guy who supposedly fiddled while Rome burned, the guy whose favorite hobby was being hated. After his glorious exit, with the help of a dagger, the empire was a hot mess. People were broke, hungry, and frankly sick of emperors treating the empire like their personal playpen. Enter Emperor Vespasian. No nonsense, no fiddling. Just a man with one goal: make Rome love the emperors again, or at least stop rioting. So what does Vespasian do? He launches the biggest PR project in Roman history, the construction of the Colosseum. Forget social media campaigns or handing out free bread. Okay, they still handed out bread. Vespasian decided the best way to distract an angry, starving population was to give them a front row seat to the greatest show on earth. State-sponsored carnage. And not just any arena. No, Vespasian wanted something so massive, so grand, that future generations would point at it and say, "Ah yes, Rome, the place where architecture and bloodlust met for coffee, the Colosseum, or the Flavian Amphitheatre, as it was originally called." Because why name it something catchy when you can name it after your dynasty? Was a symbol of imperial generosity. And by generosity, I mean look at this giant thing we built for you, so you can forget how miserable your life is. Now let's talk engineering. Rome didn't just slap some bricks together and call it a day. They built a structure so advanced it still makes modern architects weep softly into their blueprints. First off, this thing could hold 50,000 to 80,000 people. That's basically a small city crammed into one stadium. And thanks to over 80 entrances, including special VIP gates, because even in death sports, the rich got better perks, you could fill the place in minutes. The Colosseum was the ancient world's version of efficient crowd control, a miracle of organization, considering modern stadiums still struggle with getting people in without starting a small riot at the turnstiles. The building materials: concrete, brick, volcanic rock, and a whole lot of marble. Roman concrete was basically magic. Unlike today's concrete, which weathers and crumbles if you look at it funny, Roman concrete hardened over time and could survive earthquakes, fires, and 2,000 years of tourists taking bad selfies. They even layered the materials strategically. Stronger stuff on the bottom, lighter stuff on the top, because Roman engineers understood that gravity is a thing. And don't forget the clever design touches. The outer facade was made up of 3 tiers of arches, stacked like the world's fanciest lasagna. Each tier was decorated with columns in different styles. Doric on the bottom, sturdy and no-nonsense. Ionic in the middle, fancy scrolls. And Corinthian on top, all the bells and whistles. It was as if the Colosseum was saying, "We're sophisticated, and we can crush you with stone." But perhaps the most mind-boggling feature was the speed and scale of its construction. This was no decades-long vanity project. The Colosseum started under Vespasian and was mostly completed under his son Titus in just around 8 years. 8 years. Meanwhile, your neighbour still hasn't finished that backyard shed he started in 2018. And here's the kicker. It was built right over Nero's private pleasure lake. That's right. Vespasian drained the emperor's decadent artificial pond and slapped an amphitheatre on top of it, like a giant middle finger to Nero's memory. Oh, you liked your little lake? Too bad. Here's a death arena for the people. So what was the vibe when you entered the Colosseum? The good news, you could get in fast. The bad news? You were there to watch people die creatively. The Colosseum wasn't just a stadium. It was a purpose-built murder machine, a giant reminder that Rome loved a good spectacle as much as it loved good plumbing. Every arch, every stairwell, every vomitorium, that's the exit passage. Not a place to actually throw up, despite what you've heard, was designed to funnel people in and out like a well-oiled, bloodthirsty machine. In the end, Vespasian's plan worked. The people cheered, the riots stopped for a while, and the emperors got their approval ratings back up. One disemboweled gladiator at a time, the Colosseum stood as the ultimate testament to Roman power, engineering, and the unshakable belief that nothing says, "I love my citizens," like front-row seats to a lion feast. So the paint-well marble polish was barely dry on the Colosseum. And what does Emperor Titus decide? Time to throw the biggest, bloodiest party the world had ever seen. Forget your average ribbon cutting. Forget fireworks. Forget awkward speeches. Rome's idea of inaugurating a building was a 100-day orgy of violence, spectacle, and wholesale slaughter that would make even the most hardcore action movie director mutter, "Tone it down a bit, guys." Yes, you heard that right. 100 days. That's over 3 months of non-stop entertainment. And by entertainment, I mean a non-stop festival of death, danger. And let's see what happens if we put a rhino in there, with a guy holding a spear. While modern grand openings might hand out free samples or play some live music, Rome went for, "Here's 9,000 dead animals. You're welcome." Let's set the scene. The year is 80 CE. The Colosseum is gleaming, massive, and packed to the rafters with tens of thousands of Romans who've shown up to see what their tax cestus's bought them. They weren't disappointed. From the very first day, the arena delivered on its promise of heart-pounding, jaw-dropping, "Oh my gods, what am I watching" mayhem. First on the schedule, the Nationers, wild beast hunts. But these weren't polite little hunting displays. No, this was a full-blown zoo turned into a bloodbath. Lions, tigers, leopards, elephants, crocodiles. You name it, they shipped it in. Animals were imported from every dusty corner of the empire. North Africa, the Middle East, even far-flung places like India. The Romans went to more trouble acquiring exotic animals than modern collectors go to find limited edition sneakers. And once the beasts were inside, cue the mayhem. Hunters, known as bestiary, armed with nothing but courage and weapons and probably some regrets, took on these animals in fights that rarely ended well for either party. The crowd roared as beasts leapt from hidden trapdoors, sometimes staged to look like they were emerging from artificial forests or rocky outcrops constructed in the arena overnight. Roman stagecraft was next level. Think Broadway meets a butcher shop. One day, it might be a forest scene, the next a mock desert. They didn't just want a fight, they wanted drama, and oh, they got it. But the animal hunts were just the start. The Colosseum's opening games were a smorgasbord of death-dealing creativity. Executions were another fan favourite. And no, we're not talking quick and merciful. We're talking executions designed for maximum spectacle. Criminals were dressed up as mythological characters, say Icarus, and then their story would play out on the sand. Spoiler alert, Icarus doesn't survive the fall. One popular execution method involved having prisoners fight unarmed against wild animals. Imagine being told, "Your part today." Victim number 27. Try to look surprised. And then came the gladiators. The rock stars of ancient Rome. Trained fighters with flashy armor, stage names and fan clubs. Seriously, people carved love notes and slogans about their favorite gladiators into walls. The opening games saw hundreds of gladiator pairs battle it out, often in elaborate matchups designed to show off their skills, their bravery, and the creative ways they could separate someone's head from their shoulders. Some matches pitted heavily armored giants against fast, lightly armed opponents, a deadly version of can speed beat strength. Others were team fights or even mock military skirmishes, but perhaps the most mind-boggling part of these 100 days wasn't the scale of bloodshed. Although yes, it was insane, but the sheer logistics. This wasn't just a random mess of murder. There was a whole schedule, a production team, and engineers working behind the scenes to reset the stage, bring up animals from underground cages, refill the sand, because bloodstains, and keep things moving. The Colosseum had elevators. Yes, elevators powered by manpower, to lift cages and platforms right onto the arena floor. It was like a deadly pop-up book, and you better believe the Romans kept track of the body count. Over the course of those 100 days, historians estimate that around 9,000 animals met their end in the arena. The number of human casualties, let's just say they stopped counting when the abacus broke. But to Titus, this was a small price to pay for winning the crowd's love. Every day of the festival was designed to hammer home one message. Rome is powerful, Rome is rich, and Rome can afford to turn mass murder into a spectator sport. So how did the crowd feel about all this? They loved it. Romans cheered, bet on outcomes, and debated tactics, the way modern sports fans argue over penalties and plays. Merchants outside the Colosseum sold snacks, probably not popcorn, but definitely wine and meat skewers. Kids begged their parents for wooden swords and miniature gladiator helmets as souvenirs. The Colosseum wasn't just a stadium, it was Rome's ultimate theme park, only with fewer rides and way more disembowelment. By the time the 100 days wrapped up, the Colosseum's reputation was set in stone, literally and figuratively. It was the greatest show on earth, a place where life was cheap and the ticket was free, unless you wanted a good seat. And Titus, he secured his place as the emperor who gave Rome its grandest gift. 100 days of unforgettable state-sponsored murder fest. If you've ever been to a stadium and thought, wow, these nosebleed seats are terrible, just be glad you weren't in ancient Rome. Because in the Colosseum where you sat didn't just determine how well you could see the action. It told the entire city exactly how important or unimportant you were. And yes, it also decided whether your day at the games smelled like glory or like the world's largest unflushed latrine. Let's start with the basics. The Colosseum wasn't just an architectural wonder. It was a massive stone and marble snapshot of Roman society. Picture it like one big, deadly wedding reception seating chart, where every single chair screamed your rank in life. At the very bottom level, closest to the action, and therefore closest to the flying blood spatters, you'd find the creme de la creme of Roman society. Senators, top military brass, priests and VIPs, with names longer than the Colosseum's shadow. These folks weren't just close enough to see a gladiator's last breath. They could practically count the individual sand grains getting soaked in blood. And why were they down there, in the splash zone? Because the closer you were to the entertainment, the more the world knew how powerful, wealthy, and well-connected you were. The emperors themselves had their own luxurious box, naturally positioned for the best view and the safest one, because even emperors weren't fans of unexpected tiger pounces. Above the senatorial section sat the equestrians, Rome's upper middle class, wealthy, but not quite in the same league as the senators. Think of them as the folks who can afford a luxury car but not a private jet. Their seats were still great, just far enough from the action to avoid a stray tooth or spear chunk, but close enough to see the sweat on a gladiator's brow. As you moved higher up the tiers, the status dropped. Merchants, artisans, and solid citizens filled the middle sections. These were the everyday Romans who worked hard, paid taxes, and showed up to cheer for their favorite fighters, or maybe to boo the ones they hated, because even in ancient Rome, booing was a cherished tradition. Then, finally, we get to the very top, literally and socially, the nosebleed seats of the Colosseum. This was where Rome's poor slaves and women sat. That's right. Women were mostly banned from the lower levels, unless they were Vestal virgins or exceptionally high-status ladies. For everyone else, it was up to the clouds. The higher you were, the worse the view, the thinner the shade, and the stronger the smell, because way up top was where the wind carried the delightful aroma of the public toilets and the nearby sewers. If you could smell the blood, congrats, you were rich. If you could smell the toilets, well, better luck next empire. That's the Colosseum's seating policy in a nutshell. And while this might sound harsh, to the Romans it all made perfect sense. The seating plan was a direct reflection of the social order that ruled everything in their lives, from who got to vote, if they could at all, to who could wear certain colours, to who could speak first at a dinner party. What's even more fascinating is how strictly these rules were enforced. Seats were assigned, often engraved with names or titles right into the stone. No last-minute seat switching, no sweet-talking the usher, no bribing your way down a level. The ushers of the Colosseum weren't just there to help you find your spot. They were there to make sure no one forgot their place in the grand machine that was Rome. Sit in the wrong section, and you could find yourself ejected or worse, arrested for disrespecting the social order. Imagine today's sports arenas, but with armed guards to make sure you didn't sneak into the VIP box. It gets better or worse, depending on where you were sitting. The Colosseum's design ensured that comfort was just as stratified as status. The lower levels had shade provided by the Great Valerian, a massive awning rigged with ropes and pulleys, manned by sailors who unfurled it when the sun got brutal. Senators could sip wine, munch snacks, and enjoy the shade while watching the carnage below. The poor souls in the upper tiers. Let's just say sunscreen hadn't been invented, and they probably left the games looking like overcooked lobsters. Even the entrances were designed to match the pecking order. The grander your station, the grander your entryway. Senators and VIPs entered through large, marble-decorated arches. Commoners? Smaller, plainer doorways that led to steep stairs and tight corridors. The poorest had the farthest to climb, both literally and figuratively. In truth, the Colosseum was as much a tool for social control as it was for entertainment. It reminded every Roman exactly where they stood in the empire's grand hierarchy. The games weren't just about seeing who could stab whom the fastest. They were about reinforcing the idea that Rome was a well-oiled machine, with everyone in their assigned place, from emperor to beggar. So the next time you grumble about bad seats at a concert or game, remember at least you didn't have to sit so high up that you could smell the toilets more clearly than the action. The Colosseum was the ultimate arena, yes, but also the ultimate reminder that in Rome, status wasn't just everything. It decided whether your day smelled like roses or something else entirely. Long before modern TV served up Survivor or The Bachelor, ancient Rome had its own brand of reality entertainment. Only, instead of awkward rose ceremonies or immunity idols, contestants got swords, nets, tridents, and a very real chance of dying in front of tens of thousands of screaming fans. That's right. Gladiators were the rock stars, influencers, and tragic heroes of their time, except their followers cheered for blood, not sponsored posts. So who were these men, and occasionally women, who stepped onto the Colosseum's sand, knowing that today's gig might be their last? The vast majority weren't there by choice. Most gladiators were enslaved people, prisoners of war, or criminals sentenced to fight as punishment. Picture this. You've just survived a brutal Roman conquest, and as a reward you're told, good news, you're going to Rome. Bad news, you'll be helping a lion with its dental hygiene, up close. But not every gladiator was forced into it. Believe it or not, some Roman citizens volunteered. Yes, some free men, usually those desperate for fame, fortune, or a way out of crushing debt, chose the life of a gladiator. Imagine owing your neighbor a few thousand sesterces, and instead of declaring bankruptcy, you decide, you know what, maybe I can take on a guy with a trident and net. How hard can it be? Once you became a gladiator, whether by choice or chains, your next stop was the Ludus, the gladiator school. Think less Hogwarts, more Hunger Games boot camp. Here you were drilled daily, fighting, running, strength training, and learning how not to get skewered in the first 30 seconds of combat. The schools were run by lenestae, basically fight managers who invested in their gladiators, like people invest in prize racehorses today. A dead gladiator was bad for business. After all, the goal was to turn raw recruits into skilled fighters who could deliver a good show. And let's talk about the training weapons. At first you didn't get a sword or spear, you got a wooden sword or a dull blade, heavy and unwieldy, to build up your strength. Imagine doing all your drills with the ancient equivalent of a giant lead pipe. Fun times. But here's where it gets wild. Despite their grim circumstances, successful gladiators could become celebrities. Their names were known across the empire. People would paint graffiti of their favorite fighters on walls, like ancient fan art, Crixus the Gaul, 5 wins, no losses, or spiculous rules. They even inspired fashion. Yes, Roman groupies might wear charms shaped like their favorite gladiator's weapon or helmet. Some fighters became so famous that emperors gave them gifts, land, or freedom. Others received love letters, or, well, more explicit offers from adoring fans. Think of them as influencers who didn't get brand deals, just scars. Their job was to entertain, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. Every match was a performance for survival, where one wrong move might earn you a permanent retirement plan in a grave. And here's where it gets particularly Roman. Sometimes, after a match, the fate of the defeated gladiator was put to the crowd. If a fighter had fought bravely but lost, the audience, or more often, the emperor, might decide whether he lived or died. And no, it wasn't just a dramatic thumbs up or thumbs down like in the movies. The gestures were more complicated, but the idea was the same. The crowd loved having a say in whether a bloodied man should get another shot at glory, or meet the business end of a sword. Fighters who consistently won built up huge fan bases. The more popular you were, the better your chances at survival. Not because people suddenly developed morals, but because you were valuable. A good gladiator was like a good investment. Why waste a proven entertainer when you could sell more tickets to his next match? But don't be fooled by the fame. Gladiators lived under constant pressure. Most were housed in barracks, locked up at night like dangerous animals. Their daily lives were harsh, disciplined to the extreme, fed diets designed to bulk them up. Gladiators were actually nicknamed barley men because of all the carbs they ate, and treated as both prized property and disposable pawns. Even their wins didn't guarantee safety. One day, you could be the hero. The next, a new crowd favorite might be gunning for you. And what about women? While rare, there were female gladiators, gladiatresses. These women fought in special events, often as a novelty, but still under the same brutal conditions. The Romans, equal opportunity as ever when it came to violence, saw no problem with letting the ladies join in on the bloodshed. In the end, being a gladiator was like being on the deadliest reality show ever filmed. The fans were louder, the drama was bloodier, and no one went home with a rose, just scars, fame, and if they were lucky, another chance to fight again. If you thought modern zoos had questionable ethics, welcome to the Roman Colosseum's Venationers, beast shows, where the motto seemed to be, if it roared, slithered, or charged, they tried to kill it in front of an audience. Forget cute penguins and gift shops. The Colosseum's idea of wildlife appreciation was watching an elephant get jabbed by spears until it stopped moving. Truly nothing said, "We're a mighty empire," like importing exotic creatures and then immediately regretting their purchase, because, well, they tried to eat the staff. Let's start with the sheer scale of this animal carnage. Rome wasn't satisfied with local wildlife. Rabbits? Too boring. Wild boars? Please. No. They went full National Geographic and shipped in lions from North Africa, tigers from India, crocodiles from the Nile, hippos, rhinos, leopards, panthers, bears from the Alps, and even elephants. If it could be crated, carted, or dragged across land and sea, the Romans wanted it in their arena. Just imagine the logistical nightmare of trying to get a cranky rhinoceros onto a ship in Carthage and hoping it didn't decide to sink the whole thing on the voyage over, and cost astronomical. These animals were so expensive that emperors used them as PR stunts. Want to show the empire how rich and powerful you are? Don't just build a giant stadium, fill it with an ark's worth of creatures, and then let chaos ensue. Emperors like Trajan went all out during one set of games. Thousands of animals were slaughtered to celebrate his military victories. The message was clear. If we can do this to wild beasts, imagine what we'll do to our enemies. But here's the kicker. These weren't random bloodbaths. Well, not entirely. The beast shows were carefully choreographed spectacles. The Romans constructed elaborate scenery inside the Colosseum to mimic forests, deserts, or jungles, complete with fake rocks and trees. Hidden trapdoors would release animals onto the sand as if they'd magically appeared from the wilderness. One minute the arena floor looked empty. The next, surprise, you're sharing space with an angry leopard who skipped breakfast, and who had the honor of facing these creatures. Sometimes it was trained beast hunters called bestiary, who specialized in fighting dangerous animals with spears or swords. But just as often, it was people Rome wanted rid of, condemned criminals thrown into the arena unarmed. Their only real skill being the ability to scream in terror before becoming lunch. Nothing like turning a death sentence into dinner theatre. It wasn't just the fighting that made these shows so gruesome. It was the sheer creative cruelty. Elephants were forced to wear armor and fight each other. Giraffes, too confused to even know what was happening, were slaughtered simply for novelty. Crocodiles were dragged out to flop uselessly on the sand while bored hunters poked at them. And don't even ask how they got the hippos in there. Let's just say Roman animal wranglers earned their hazard pay. Or, more likely, an early grave. The beast shows weren't just about killing for sport. They were symbolic. The animals represented the empire's conquests, its dominion over nature, its reach across continents. When a Roman crowd watched a lion die on the arena floor, it wasn't just a dead cat to them. It was a metaphor for Rome's victory over Africa. Subtle? Not really. Effective? Absolutely. The crowd roared louder than the animals. Of course, it wasn't all smooth sailing. Animals don't always stick to the script. And sometimes the hunters became the hunted. There are records of panthers leaping into the stands, elephants going on rampages, and bears who seemed less interested in the guy with the spear and more interested in the front row. Let's just say that ancient Rome didn't have insurance policies for death by tiger during intermission. Behind the scenes, managing this living menagerie was a nightmare. The Colosseum's underground levels, dark, cramped corridors and cages, housed the animals before their grand entrance. Picture it. Dozens of lions pacing, elephants stomping, bears growling, all crammed into stone chambers that smelled like a combination of wet dog, fear, and last week's disaster. Teams of slaves and handlers worked feverishly to move the animals up to the arena floor, using pulleys, elevators, and ramps. All it took was one loose cage door, and your average Tuesday could turn into a mass panic. And here's a fun, or horrifying fact. The slaughter was so extensive that the Romans started running low on exotic animals. Over time, the Colosseum's appetite for wildlife contributed to the decline of certain species in the empire's territories. It turns out, if you kill thousands of lions, eventually you're going to notice fewer lions roaming around. Who knew? In short, the beast shows were Rome's way of flexing its imperial muscles while indulging the bloodlust of the masses. It was the worst petting zoo in history. One where the animals didn't get fed, they were the entertainment. If there's any silver lining, it's that eventually, even the Romans began to tire of the carnage, or maybe they just ran out of animals to import. Picture this. You walk into the Colosseum, expecting the usual gladiators, lions, maybe a bear with attitude, and instead you find yourself staring at what looks suspiciously like a small sea. Welcome to the most over-the-top entertainment the Roman Empire could dream up. Namarchia, mock naval battles. Because obviously when you've got a massive stone stadium, the next logical step is to turn it into a giant bathtub. Rome saw a dry stadium and thought, what this really needs is a small ocean, and not just for the novelty. No. This was about showing off power, engineering brilliance, and Rome's absolute refusal to do anything halfway. If you were going to simulate a sea battle, you might as well bring the sea to you. But let's pause for a moment and ask the obvious. How on earth did they flood the Colosseum? The logistics alone are enough to give any modern event planner a nervous breakdown. First off, the Romans didn't just toss buckets of water over the walls and call it a day. The Colosseum was ingeniously linked to a complex system of aqueducts and underground channels. When they wanted to stage a naval battle, they'd open specially designed sluices that let water pour into the arena, transforming the flat sand floor into a watery combat zone. Think of it like pulling the plug on a giant bath, only in reverse, and with a lot more risk of drowning your performers. Of course, this wasn't just a puddle we're talking about. The arena had to be filled deep enough to float small ships, typically scaled-down galleys with oarsmen, sails, and occasionally some terrified guy whose job it was to steer. The water level had to be just right, too shallow, and the ships would get stuck too deep. And well, congratulations. You've accidentally built a very expensive Roman swimming pool. And who fought in these aquatic spectacles? Much like the beast shows and gladiator duels, it was often prisoners or condemned criminals who got the dubious honor of reenacting famous naval battles. Imagine being told, hey, remember that time the Romans crushed the pirates at Actium? Well, you're going to be the pirate today. Good luck with that. These poor souls were shoved into ships, handed a weapon, and told to make it entertaining, while also, ideally, not drowning before the action started. And what kind of battles did they stage? The Romans loved historical reenactments, basically their version of a school play, except with more swords and fewer awkward costume malfunctions. They'd recreate famous sea victories, often pitting different groups against each other for dramatic effect. It was theatre, blood sport, and naval drill all rolled into one. If you're wondering how chaotic this all was, the answer is extremely. Ships collided, oars snapped, and men fell overboard and had to scramble for their lives. The Colosseum wasn't exactly equipped with lifeguards, and let's be honest, saving a drowning man didn't really fit the tone of the event. The audience came for carnage, not compassion. If someone went under and didn't come back up, that was just part of the show. Now, let's take a moment to appreciate the sheer ambition of this idea. The Colosseum wasn't designed as a water arena. This meant that every time they wanted to stage one of these mock sea battles, they had to go to absurd lengths to make it happen. Engineers had to ensure the water didn't flood the surrounding parts of the city. Slaves worked tirelessly to fill, maintain, and later drain the massive basin. And the cleanup? You think your neighbor's above-ground pool is a hassle? Try emptying thousands of gallons of water, while also retrieving wrecked ships, weapons, bodies, and the occasional crocodile that someone thought would spice things up. And here's the kicker. Rome didn't even stick with the naval battles for long. The Colosseum's underground hypogeum, that labyrinth of cages, tunnels, and machinery you've heard about, made these water shows increasingly impractical. Once they built permanent structures beneath the arena for all their trapdoors and elevators, flooding the floor became impossible without ruining the whole system. In other words, Rome's love affair with aquatic carnage was impressive, but brief, like a flashy trend that everyone's obsessed with for a year, and then quietly forgets. Naval battles fell out of favor as land-based slaughter proved far easier to manage. But oh, while it lasted, it was peak Roman extra. Because why have an ordinary fight when you could have one involving ships, drowning, and the constant risk of accidentally creating a swamp in the middle of your capital? In the end, the Nolmachiae at the Colosseum stand as a testament to Rome's unique blend of genius and madness. Only the Romans would look at a perfectly functional sports arena and decide that what it really needed was to double as a man-made sea. The good news? It worked. The bad news? Hope you brought a towel and maybe a life vest. You've bought your ticket to the Colosseum. You find your seat, hopefully not near the public latrines, and the crowd's buzzing with excitement. You're ready for some good, honest, brutal entertainment. But just as you're wondering where the next act is coming from, bam, a tiger bursts out of the floor like some hellish party crasher. Welcome to the magic of the Hypogeum, the underground nerve center of the Colosseum. Think of it as Rome's version of backstage tech, except instead of fog machines and laser lights, it featured trapdoors, elevators, and a non-zero chance of being eaten by surprise wildlife. Let's start with what the Hypogeum actually was. Hidden beneath the arena floor was a sprawling two-level complex of tunnels, chambers, cages, and mechanical contraptions. Imagine a giant underground maze designed by someone who wanted their guests to have a 50-50th chance of being mauled before lunch. This was where gladiators waited, trembling or hyping themselves up before their big moment. It was where animals paced in cages, no doubt regretting whatever life choices led them to this point. And above all, it was where Roman engineering reached peak over-the-top brilliance. Now this wasn't just some dungeon with rusty doors. The Hypogeum was cutting-edge technology for its day. The Romans built an entire system of lifts and elevators, operated by teams of slaves hauling on ropes and pulleys, to raise animals, fighters, and even entire stage sets up to the arena floor. 1 second, you're looking at a flat expanse of sand. The next, the ground splits open, and out pops a fully grown elephant, a panther, or a gladiator, who's wondering how the heck he got talked into this gig. And it wasn't just about raising things up. The element of surprise was crucial to the drama of the games. The arena was studded with dozens of hidden trapdoors, carefully camouflaged to blend with the sand and floorboards. When triggered, these openings allowed for animals and fighters to emerge suddenly, creating moments of shock and awe for the spectators. Picture it. A condemned man nervously scanning the arena for threats, only for a lion to materialize behind him like the world's deadliest jump scare. It's like whack-a-mole, but with tigers and people. The mechanics of these lifts were no small feat. The elevators worked on a system of counterweights and winches, with teams of men pushing, pulling, and cranking to make it all happen. Some of the platforms were simple, flat surfaces for a single animal or person. Others were full-blown cages on lifts, designed to release the creature at just the right dramatic moment. And these weren't just slow, clunky platforms either. Eyewitnesses described how the doors would suddenly fly open and the lifts shoot up, delivering their lethal cargo onto the stage in an instant. Timing was everything. You didn't want your Grand Lion entrance to turn into an awkward, half-lifted, half-jammed mess, while the crowd waited and tapped their sandals impatiently. But the Romans didn't stop at practical use. They added flair. The Hypogeum also supported elaborate scenery changes. Want the floor of the arena to look like a forest? They could do that. Need fake rocks or temple facades to suddenly appear as part of a battle setup? Done. The underground machinery helped pull off these set transformations, letting the Colosseum switch between different themes with dazzling speed. It was theatre, engineering, and sadism rolled into one. Of course, all this required massive manpower. Operating the Hypogeum's machinery took hundreds of slaves and workers. These teams coordinated like stagehands at the deadliest show on Earth, making sure the lifts rose on cue, the trapdoors opened at the right moment, and the animals didn't eat the wrong person too soon. One wrong move, and you might find yourself sharing a dark tunnel with an escaped leopard that's in no mood to be part of the act anymore. And let's not forget, all this had to work seamlessly in front of tens of thousands of spectators. There was no room for technical glitches. No oops. Sorry folks. The tigers stuck halfway up. The Romans prided themselves on their ability to deliver blood-soaked spectacles with the same precision you might expect from a modern theatre production. If your theatre production featured live animals and no health and safety regulations whatsoever, one of the most impressive aspects of the Hypogeum is just how much of it survives today. When archaeologists explored these underground levels, they found remnants of the elevator shafts, the grooves worn deep into the stone by centuries of use, and the iron fittings that once secured the machinery. Even in ruins, the engineering genius is obvious. You can practically hear the creak of the winches, the groan of the ropes, and the roar of the crowd above, as another poor soul is hoisted into the most terrifying spotlight imaginable. In the end, the Hypogeum turned the Colosseum from a mere killing field into a place of suspense and drama. The audience never knew what was coming next, or from where. The sand could split open beneath a fighter's feet. A hidden gate could unleash a pack of wolves. The floor itself became part of the show, alive with hidden danger, and if nothing else, it made sure no one in the stands ever got bored, because in Rome's greatest arena, even the ground wanted to eliminate you. Picture the Colosseum at its peak. The roar of the crowd, the clash of steel, the occasional tiger leap scaring some unlucky soul. Now fast forward a few centuries. The blood is gone. The gladiators are history. And the mighty arena is, well, kind of a fixer-upper. One day you're watching epic battles. The next you're renting a room above the old lion cage. Welcome to the weird, forgotten chapter of the Colosseum's story, when Rome's grandest monument became less empire of spectacle and more prime real estate opportunity. So how does the most famous stadium in history go from VIP carnage zone to neighborhood? Blame a mix of politics, economics, and honestly, good old-fashioned neglect. By the 5th century AD, the Roman Empire wasn't doing so hot, with barbarians at the gates, sometimes literally, the treasury empty, and the people more worried about survival than seeing crocodiles fight dudes with spears. The Colosseum fell out of fashion. The last recorded games were held in the 6th century, and after that, silence. Well, except for the crows, stray dogs, and the occasional squatter moving in. But the Colosseum wasn't going to just sit there looking picturesque in the sunset. Oh no. The people of Rome are nothing if not resourceful. This massive structure was too good to waste. What followed was one of history's strangest building makeovers. The Colosseum as apartment block, medieval castle, workshop, hub, and quarry. First up, housing. At some point in the early Middle Ages, people started moving in. Imagine being a medieval landlord showing off the place. Yes, your room overlooks the forum. Lovely view. Just mind the holes where we pulled out the iron clamps holding the stones together. Families built homes right into the arches and passageways, carving out cozy, if slightly draughty spaces in what was once the world's deadliest stadium. Over time, the structure turned into a bustling, if unusual, residential neighborhood. Kids played where gladiators once fought. Laundry flapped from windows cut into ancient stone. The echoes of battles were replaced by the sounds of goats bleating and pots clattering, but apartments were just the start. Parts of the Colosseum morphed into workshops and markets. Blacksmiths set up forges where noblemen once cheered for blood. Tanners cured hides in spaces once used to store deadly beasts. The same corridors that had once funneled lions and gladiators onto the sands now rang with the sounds of hammering, sawing, and bargaining. It was less an arena of death, more an ancient Roman version of a pop-up craft fair, with more pigeons. Then came the fortress years. Rome's powerful families, those medieval clans who loved a good feud, took one look at the Colosseum and thought, what a fantastic place for a defensive stronghold. And who could blame them? The walls were thick, the position was commanding, and honestly, who wouldn't want to rule their enemies from a throne built on top of the world's most famous slaughterhouse? The Frangipani family, whose name sounds like a dessert, but whose reputation was pure Game of Thrones, fortified the Colosseum in the 12th century, turning it into a mini-castle. Towers were added, gates were reinforced. If you were a rival family, storming this place was not on your to-do list. Meanwhile, the Colosseum was also slowly being cannibalized. The great amphitheater, built of stone, concrete, and marble, was basically one massive home improvement store, just waiting to be plundered. Need materials for your new palace? Just grab some marble from the Colosseum. Want a nice column for your church? The Colosseum's got plenty. Over the centuries, cartloads of stone and decorative pieces were stripped from the structure and hauled off to build other parts of Rome, including St. Peter's Basilica. The Colosseum was, in essence, Rome's recycling bin. And let's not forget, nature's role. With the crowds and the games gone, the arena floor became a kind of accidental botanical garden. Grass, shrubs, and even trees took root in the cracks. By the Renaissance, the Colosseum was famous not just as a ruin, but as a weirdly biodiverse park, home to hundreds of plant species that had hitchhiked to Rome from across the empire, their seeds dropped by animals or soldiers centuries earlier. Tourists came not to marvel at the architecture, but to collect rare flowers. Gladiators and lions, out, wildflowers, very in. It wasn't until much later, during the Renaissance and beyond, that people started thinking, hey, maybe we should stop pulling this place apart, brick by brick. Popes and city leaders finally put a halt to the scavenging and began efforts to preserve what was left. The apartments were cleared out, the workshops shuttered, the fortress elements crumbled, and the Colosseum entered its next chapter as a monument to the past, a symbol of both Rome's glory and its fall. So the next time you see the Colosseum and think of gladiators and emperors, remember that for a good chunk of its history, it was less about epic battles and more about everyday life. A giant reminder that even the grandest structures can end up with laundry lines hanging between their pillars. Ah, the Colosseum. Once the ultimate venue for blood, guts, and applause, it fell into centuries of disrepair, as we saw. But like a Roman phoenix, if phoenixes were made of stone and missing half their walls, this battered amphitheater staged a different kind of comeback. The story of the Colosseum's symbolic rebirth isn't about gladiators or lions. It's about meaning. And as it turns out, nothing says look how far we've come like a ruin that used to be the murder capital of the ancient world. Let's start in the Middle Ages, when most folks weren't thinking, hey, what a great piece of heritage. Instead, they saw the Colosseum as a handy pile of pre-cut building materials, or a fortified base, as we covered. Its grandeur, mostly forgotten, its history, fading. But here's the twist. Even as the Colosseum fell apart, stone by stone, myths and legends started to cling to its crumbling arches like ivy. Medieval minds, steeped in superstition and Christian faith, began spinning new tales about the Colosseum. Some believed it was the site of Christian martyrdom, a place where early followers of Jesus had been thrown to the beasts or skewered by gladiators for the amusement of pagan emperors. Now, to be clear, historians have found very little actual evidence that Christians were systematically executed in the Colosseum, at least not in the numbers that legend suggests. But let's face it, history loves a dramatic story, and the image of brave martyrs facing lions under the gaze of bloodthirsty crowds, that stuck. By the Renaissance, Attitudes toward ancient ruins in general, and the Colosseum in particular, began to shift. Humanists and scholars, rediscovering the glory of Rome, saw these battered structures not as quarries or fortresses, but as awe-inspiring remnants of a once great civilization. The Colosseum, with its immense size and haunting silhouette, became a symbol of lost grandeur. Poets and painters flocked to sketch its arches, while architects studied its bones to revive the art of building like the Romans. It was the architectural equivalent of realizing your grandfather's dusty old pocket watch is actually a priceless heirloom. And then came the ultimate Roman glow-up. The Colosseum's transformation into a sacred Christian symbol. Enter the popes. By the 18th century, the Catholic Church had taken a renewed interest in the ruin, not as a stadium, not as a handy source of marble, but as a holy site. The idea that Christians had died there, fact or embellishment, had taken deep root, and the popes weren't going to miss the opportunity to connect Rome's most famous landmark to the faith. Pope Benedict XIV, in particular, decided the Colosseum needed a little divine rebranding. In 1749, he declared the Colosseum sanctified by the blood of Christian martyrs, and installed the Stations of the Cross along its inner perimeter. Now, instead of imagining gladiators duking it out with wild animals, visitors were invited to reflect on Christ's passion. The arena floor, once stained with blood from combat, became a place of prayer and pilgrimage. Forget about lions and swords. Now it was about rosaries and blessings, the ultimate PR move really, and the symbolism didn't stop at religion. By the 19th century, as Italian nationalists dreamed of a unified Italy, the Colosseum took on another layer of meaning, a symbol not just of Christian sacrifice, but of Roman endurance. Here was a building that had survived barbarians, earthquakes, stone thieves, and centuries of neglect. If the Colosseum could endure all that, surely the Italian spirit could too. It became the backdrop for patriotic poetry, romantic paintings, and the occasional political rally. Visitors, from grand tour scholars in powdered wigs to wide-eyed tourists with sketchbooks, came to see the Colosseum not as a place of horror, but as a testament to time itself. The ruins spoke of the fleeting nature of power, the glory of ancient Rome, and the resilience of stone against the endless march of history. And let's be honest, it made for one heck of a dramatic sunset backdrop. In modern times, the Colosseum's symbolic role has only grown. It's lit up in gold to oppose the death penalty worldwide. It stands as a reminder of human cruelty and human achievement. No longer a venue for violence, it's become a place where people come to reflect, to marvel, and to pose awkwardly for selfies. So yes, the Colosseum went from a stadium of slaughter to a churchyard of sorts, from a ruin to a rallying cry. It's proof that even the bloodiest monuments can be reclaimed, reinterpreted, and reborn. The ultimate Roman glow-up, indeed. The Colosseum today is a survivor, a weathered, weary champion that has outlasted emperors, popes, looters, earthquakes, pollution, and the occasional tourist who thinks climbing over the barriers for a selfie is a good idea. Spoiler, it's not. But let's be honest, this monument isn't quite the sparkling showpiece it was when Emperor Vespasian's crew first unveiled it. You might say the Colosseum is like an aging celebrity, still iconic, still commanding attention, but missing some of its original shine, and maybe a few teeth, and an eyebrow or two. Let's break down what's left standing, what's missing, and how Rome has fought tooth and nail and trowel and scaffolding to keep this mighty amphitheatre from collapsing into a pile of photogenic rubble. What's gone, the bling and the brains? First up, the marble. Oh, the marble. When the Colosseum first opened its doors, it gleamed. The seats, the corridors, the facade, all trimmed, capped, or paved with brilliant white marble that reflected the sun like Rome was showing off. But look around today, that marble is long gone. Over the centuries, it was chiseled out, hauled off, and repurposed for other Roman landmarks. Ever admire the marble in St. Peter's Basilica? Yup, some of that came straight from the Colosseum. The ancient amphitheatre was less demolished, more upcycled. And then there's the metal. Ancient Roman builders were clever folks. They used iron clamps to bind the massive stone blocks together. Kind of like rebar before rebar was cool, but iron's valuable. And by the Middle Ages, scavengers were prying those clamps out of the stonework. What did that mean for the Colosseum? Well, let's just say that without its internal braces, parts of the structure started looking less like mighty monument and more like Jenga game in progress. What's more, the decorative statues, reliefs, and precious metals that once adorned the Colosseum's many arches and alcoves, gone, melted down, stolen or worn away by time. Today, the Colosseum's beauty lies in its bones, stripped down but still standing proud. Why it's still here? Restoration, rescue, and sheer Roman stubbornness. So how has this grand ruin defied gravity and history for nearly 2,000 years? Credit where it's due, Rome didn't entirely abandon its fallen superstar. Over the last few centuries, there's been wave after wave of restoration efforts, each with its own idea of what saving the Colosseum should look like. In the 19th century, after parts of the outer wall collapsed in earthquakes, engineers rushed in with brick reinforcements and stabilizing arches. Some of these fixes weren't exactly subtle. If you spot parts of the Colosseum that look suspiciously clean and modern, you're seeing 19th century handiwork. But hey, it beats watching the whole thing topple over. Fast forward to the 20th and 21st centuries, and the mission has shifted from just keep it upright to preserving its dignity. Teams of archaeologists, architects, and conservationists work constantly to slow the damage from pollution, weathering, and the sheer foot traffic of millions of tourists. There's laser cleaning to remove grime, advanced mapping of every crack and crevice, and ambitious plans to rebuild sections, including a proposed new retractable arena floor. It's the Colosseum as you've never seen it, part ancient ruin, part high-tech science project. And while restoration keeps it standing, the Colosseum has found a modern purpose that gives new meaning to those ancient stones. Today, this former arena of death serves as a global monument against capital punishment. Since 2000, whenever a death sentence is commuted somewhere in the world, the Colosseum is illuminated in golden light, a brilliant glow that says, "We've learned a thing or two since the days of gladiators." A fitting twist. The place that once cheered on executions now stands as a beacon for mercy, the eternal crowd. Of course, no tale of the Colosseum today is complete without mentioning the tourists. Every year, millions swarm its arches, snapping selfies, taking tours, and trying to imagine what it must have been like to sit in the front row as a tiger charged across the sand. The Colosseum has become the heart of Roman tourism, as iconic as gelato or mopeds zipping through traffic. And while it's missing most of its fancy bits, it doesn't really matter. Visitors aren't here for polished marble. They're here for the atmosphere, the history, the sense of standing where emperors and gladiators once stood. So yes, the Colosseum may have lost its marble, its metal, and its original purpose. But what's left is something arguably greater. A monument not to violence but to endurance. A battered but beautiful reminder that even in ruin, there can be strength, grace, and meaning. As for the missing parts, after 2,000 years, who isn't missing a few fancy bits? Now let's talk about the story of Christopher Columbus, the man who got lost and claimed he meant to picture it. Genoa, Italy, mid-1400s, a bustling port city full of salty sea air, shouting merchants, and the occasional pickpocket who could snatch a coin purse faster than you could say, "Mamma mia." Among this chaos was a boy named Cristoforo Colombo, known to us as Christopher Columbus, the son of a respectable but not so wealthy wool weaver. Yes, before he dreamed of conquering oceans, little Chris was probably tangled up in wool threads, helping in his father's shop, and daydreaming about adventures far beyond the loom. Columbus's early life wasn't exactly cushy. Genoa was a tough place, where merchants, sailors and traders rubbed shoulders, and occasionally fists. The port's constant buzz of ships coming and going was like fuel for the imagination of a boy who preferred staring at sails on the horizon over spindles of wool. It didn't take long before the sea called to him louder than any loom ever could. By his teens, Columbus had managed to escape wool duty and was working aboard merchant ships. This was no cruise, mind you. We're talking rickety vessels, questionable food, think hard biscuits that doubled as dental challenges, and endless risk of storms or pirates. Speaking of risk, Columbus got more than his fair share of close calls at sea. One of the more dramatic episodes. A ship he served on was attacked off the coast of Portugal. Columbus, showing either bravery or sheer panic, jumped overboard and swam to safety. Imagine flailing around in your medieval tunic, trying not to drown while dodging burning debris. It's the kind of thing that either convinces you to stay on dry land forever, in Columbus's case, makes you even more determined to master the ocean. The man had a stubborn streak the size of an Atlantic gale. Now, if there was one thing Columbus loved more than the sea, it was maps. He was obsessed with them. Think of him as the medieval equivalent of that kid who can't stop looking at Google Earth. Columbus pored over every chart he could find, often in Lisbon, where he settled for a while. A city full of sailors, explorers and navigators who swapped wild stories of distant lands. The problem was, maps back then weren't exactly reliable. Some still showed sea monsters lounging in the waves or islands that didn't exist. But Columbus didn't mind. In fact, he saw those inaccuracies as opportunities. If no one knew what was really out there, maybe he could be the guy who found it first. And here's where his big idea took shape, or at least started wobbling dangerously toward disaster. Inspired by the writings of ancient thinkers and some dodgy math, Columbus became convinced that sailing west would be a shortcut to Asia. Forget the long, pirate-infested route around Africa. Why not go the other way? To be fair, the idea of the Earth being round wasn't the revolutionary part. Most educated people already knew that. The issue was size, Columbus believed, thanks to optimistic estimates and selective reading, that the Earth was a lot smaller than it actually is. He thought Asia was just a hop, skip, and jump across the Western Sea. In reality, he was off by a continent or two. Oops, but here's where the magic and the comedy of Columbus starts to shine. He didn't just think outside the box. He kicked the box into the harbor and tried to navigate around it. Where other navigators saw impossible distances and certain doom, Columbus saw an opportunity for glory, gold, and eternal fame. Never mind that respected scholars kept pointing out his math didn't add up. Never mind that seasoned sailors thought the plan was bonkers. Columbus had vision. And when vision combines with stubbornness, well, let's just say history gets interesting. Another thing that fueled Columbus's determination, his belief that God had chosen him for this mission. Yes, on top of dodgy geography, Columbus was convinced he was divinely appointed to spread Christianity to new lands, or at least claim a lot of them, in the name of the Spanish crown. It wasn't just about trade routes, it was about destiny. And okay, probably about gold too. So by the time Columbus was in his 30s, he wasn't just a wool weaver's kid with sea legs. He was a man on a mission, driven by ambition, faith, and some very questionable calculations. He just needed someone to bankroll his wild plan. But that, dear listeners, is a tale for another chapter. Picture Christopher Columbus marching into royal courts with a twinkle in his eye, and a plan that most people with any sense politely described as deeply flawed. The pitch: fund my voyage west, and I'll open up a brand new, faster trade route to Asia. What could go wrong? Spoiler: everything. Let's start with his first stop, Portugal. Columbus figured Portugal was a good bet. After all, the Portuguese were masters of exploration at the time. They had already sent ships down the coast of Africa and were inching toward India by hugging the coastline like nervous swimmers. Surely they'd be excited about a shortcut across the Atlantic. Not so much. The Portuguese court heard Columbus out, nodded thoughtfully, and then essentially said, "Thanks, but no thanks." Why? Because their experts actually did the math. Columbus's distance estimates were laughably off. According to him, Asia was just a short jaunt across the sea. According to reality, there was a massive ocean and an unknown continent in the way. The Portuguese were too smart and too busy perfecting their own route around Africa to waste ships on what sounded like a suicide mission. Undeterred, Columbus shopped his plan around like a determined door-to-door salesman. He tried England next, and France after that. Both kingdoms were polite enough to listen, but passed faster than you can say nautical disaster. The English in particular were skeptical. They liked the idea of trade, but not enough to fund a madman with a map that might as well have been drawn in crayon. And France, let's just say they had their own problems and weren't keen on gambling their gold on a Genoese dreamer. But here's where Columbus's persistence or stubbornness, depending on how charitable you're feeling, really kicked in. After multiple rejections, most people would have gotten the hint and gone back to weaving wool, or maybe opened a nice tavern. Not Columbus. He packed up his maps, charts, and persuasive speeches and headed for Spain. At the time, Spain was still catching its breath from the centuries-long Reconquista, the effort to drive Muslim rule out of the Iberian Peninsula. In 1492, a date we'll hear a lot, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile had just conquered Granada, the last Muslim stronghold in Spain. In short, they were feeling ambitious, flush with victory, and itching for their next big move. Columbus saw his opportunity. He framed his pitch in just the right way to appeal to the Spanish royals' egos. This wasn't just about trade, he argued. It was about glory, God, and gold. He promised that his voyage would not only open a faster trade route to Asia's riches, but also help spread Christianity to lands as yet unconverted or uncontacted. Spain could beat Portugal to the punch, expand Christendom, and rake in untold wealth. And while Columbus's math was still laughably wrong, it's worth noting that Ferdinand and Isabella weren't exactly hiring him as a math tutor. They saw a chance to outdo their rivals and burnish their reputations. And what did Columbus want in return? Oh, just a few small things. He asked for noble titles. He wanted to be called Admiral of the Ocean Sea. Not exactly modest. He wanted to be named Viceroy and Governor over any lands he discovered. And most audacious of all, he demanded 10% of all the riches found or traded as a result of his voyage. Forever. Basically, he was angling for a lifetime cut of profits from anything involving the New World. If this were Shark Tank, the sharks would have laughed him out of the studio. But somehow, Columbus managed to wear the Spanish monarchs down. At first, Ferdinand and Isabella hesitated. Their advisors weren't sold on the plan. Remember, the math still didn't add up, and the treasury was a bit strained after funding all those wars. But Columbus, ever the persistent dreamer, kept pushing. He even threatened to take his talents elsewhere, maybe back to France or England. The nerve. Eventually a key figure at court, Luis de Santangel, a royal finance official, helped seal the deal. He convinced Isabella that the potential rewards were worth the risk, especially since the cost of outfitting a few ships was in the grand scheme of things relatively small. So against the advice of many experts and probably a few accountants tearing their hair out, Ferdinand and Isabella said yes. They agreed to Columbus's outlandish terms and gave him 3 small ships, enough supplies for what they thought would be a quick trip, and their blessing, though they likely crossed their fingers behind their backs. And with that, Columbus went from a dreamer with rejected proposals to the man leading what would become one of the most consequential voyages in history, all thanks to a pitch that combined bad math, big promises, and just the right amount of royal ambition. When Christopher Columbus finally convinced the Spanish crown to fund his daring red, wildly miscalculated westward voyage, he wasn't exactly handed the best ships in the royal fleet. No, for this grand expedition that was supposed to open a shortcut to Asia's wealth, Columbus was given 3 modest vessels, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. Let's be clear, these weren't colossal galleons bristling with cannons. These were small, creaky caravels and a slightly larger carrack, designed more for hugging coastlines than boldly crossing an entire ocean. Picture trying to cross the Atlantic in what amounts to 3 oversized bathtubs with sails, and the crew, well, let's just say they weren't exactly Spain's finest. Most were sailors who couldn't say no to a paycheck, no matter how risky the job. Many had criminal records, debts, or simply bad luck that forced them to sign up for what sounded like a suicide mission. After all, most folks in Spain at the time believed that if you sailed too far west, you'd either fall off the edge of the world. Yes, that myth still lingered among the less educated, or drift forever into a waterlogged oblivion. So finding willing volunteers wasn't easy. Columbus's crew was a ragtag bunch, part adventurer, part desperado, part I really didn't have a better option. Supplies for the voyage were about as inspiring as the ships. They packed the basics, hardtack those delightful rock-hard biscuits sailors loved to break their teeth on, salted meat, dried beans, barrels of water that would turn rank and green halfway across, and of course wine, because nothing says responsible seafaring like putting tipsy men in charge of ships during a storm. Oh, and they brought trade goods too, beads, bells, and cheap trinkets. Columbus was convinced that these would wow the people of Asia. Spoiler, they didn't find Asia, and the locals weren't particularly wowed. On August 3rd, 1492, the trio of ships set sail from Palos de la Frontera. The mood was hopeful at first. Crisp sea breezes, the thrill of adventure. But as the days dragged into weeks, That excitement soured faster than their water supply. The endless blue of the Atlantic stretched in all directions, and the reassuring sight of land faded from memory. The farther they sailed, the more anxious the crew grew. They weren't just afraid of running out of food or water, they feared the unknown, sea monsters, storms, and the possibility that Columbus was leading them to certain doom. Columbus, to his credit, or maybe his credit as a practiced con artist, had a plan for keeping the crew from mutinying. He kept 2 logs. The real log tracked their true westward progress, a steady march into the terrifying unknown. But the fake log, that one recorded a shorter distance, a comforting lie to reassure the crew that they hadn't gone too far from home and could still turn back. Imagine the captain of your plane telling you you're an hour from your destination when really, you're still over the ocean with a questionable amount of fuel left. That's the kind of morale management Columbus practiced. Days turned into weeks, the food spoiled, the water turned foul, the men grumbled louder and louder, and Columbus's authority began to look as shaky as his geography. At several points it was clear the crew was thinking about dumping him overboard and turning back, but Columbus kept them going with promises of riches just over the horizon, and, perhaps more importantly, no land to turn toward, even if they did mutiny. And then, at last, on October 12, 1492, after more than 2 months at sea, a lookout aboard the Pinta spotted land. The cry of Tierra, Tierra, rang out, sparking jubilation on all 3 ships. Sailors wept, prayed, and likely kissed the deck beneath their feet. Columbus, ever the optimist or delusional depending on how you see it, was convinced he had made it to Asia, perhaps an island off the coast of Japan or China. In reality, they had arrived in the Bahamas, a world away from Asia, but close enough for Columbus's ego. Columbus and his men went ashore, planting the Spanish flag and claiming the land for the crown, as one did in those days, without asking the locals for their thoughts on the matter. The indigenous Taino people watched these strange bearded men in armor disembark, probably wondering why their Asian visitors were so confused about where they were. Columbus named the island San Salvador, convinced he was on the doorstep of the riches of the East. Just a few more islands, he thought, and we'll hit the jackpot. Little did he know, he was standing at the edge of a new world, one he hadn't even realized existed. Thus began one of history's most famous cases of mistaken identity. Columbus thought he'd made it to Asia. In truth, he had stumbled into an entirely different hemisphere, but as far as he was concerned, mission accomplished. Now all that was left was to find the gold he'd promised the Spanish royals, and that, as we'll see, would drive the next chaotic chapters of his journey. When Columbus stepped onto the sandy shores of what he was sure were islands off Asia, spoiler, they weren't. His first thought wasn't, what a beautiful paradise. No, it was, where's the gold? And that sums up the tone of what would follow, a combination of wonder, confusion, and a relentless gold-digging mission that would set the stage for centuries of disaster. The locals, the Taino people, watched as these strange pale men in metal hats and itchy wool clothes stumbled ashore, carrying flags, crosses, and swords. For the Taino, this was probably like watching a group of lost hikers wander out of the woods, demand your hammock, and then try to sell you beads in exchange for your coconuts. The Taino were generous, welcoming, and curious. They greeted Columbus and his crew with food, gifts, and hospitality. In return, Columbus noted in his journal, with the casual greed of a man mentally filling a treasure chest, how docile and kind these people were. He wrote that they would make excellent servants, because of course, that's exactly what you think when someone gives you a warm welcome. Columbus immediately began trading with the Taino. They offered him parrots, cotton, and food in exchange for beads, bells, and other cheap trinkets that Columbus had brought along. Imagine being told you've reached the great empires of Asia, and all they want is your costume jewelry. If there was any moment where Columbus should have thought, maybe I'm not in China, it was probably here. But no. Columbus convinced himself these islanders must live on the outskirts of Asia, maybe a stone's throw from the riches of Japan or India. And then came the obsession with gold. Columbus had promised Ferdinand and Isabella vast wealth, so when he saw that some Taino wore small bits of gold jewelry, just nose rings and tiny adornments, his eyes probably lit up like a cartoon villain's. In his journal, he couldn't stop talking about gold. Where did it come from? How much was there? Could they lead him to the source? The Taino, eager to be friendly, Or maybe just trying to get these strange guests off their beach, gestured vaguely inland. Big mistake. Columbus took that as confirmation that mountains of gold were just waiting to be claimed, mined, and shipped back to Spain. This belief would fuel his increasingly aggressive demands and expeditions in the islands. And of course, there was the matter of planting the Spanish flag, because nothing says, "Thanks for the hospitality," like sticking a flag in someone's backyard and declaring the land yours. Columbus and his men planted the royal banners of Castile and Aragon on the beaches, performed official-sounding ceremonies, and announced that these lands now belonged to Spain, all without consulting the people who'd actually been living there for generations. It's the historical equivalent of crashing a party, moving into the master bedroom, and telling the owners you're in charge now. To Columbus, this wasn't just formality, it was business. Every island he came across, he claimed. He renamed places with European names, scribbling them onto maps, as if centuries of local history didn't exist. The Taino had their own names for their homelands, names rich with meaning and tradition. But to Columbus, those didn't matter. What mattered was that he could report back to Spain with proof of new territories, discovered and claimed in the name of Christendom. And let's not skip over the sheer awkwardness of these early encounters. Columbus and his men spoke no Taino, and the Taino spoke no Spanish. The result? A lot of exaggerated gestures, pointing, miming, and misunderstanding. When Columbus asked about gold, the Taino probably gave directions that made sense to them, but to Columbus, it all sounded like clues on a treasure map. When Columbus offered bells or beads, the Taino likely saw them as interesting curiosities, not tokens of some grand trade agreement. It was a comedy of errors, except the consequences would soon turn tragic. And yet, in these first days, there was no violence. There was curiosity, generosity, and cautious friendship. But Columbus wasn't content with friendship. His mind was already leaping ahead, imagining mines, wealth, conversions to Christianity, and a new world under European rule. He began taking notes on potential servants, considering which of the locals could be brought back to Spain as proof of his success, or as interpreters, or, let's be honest, as prizes. This chapter of the story, the first contact between two worlds, could have gone so differently. It could have been a moment of exchange, of mutual respect, of curiosity, without conquest. Instead, it became the opening act of an age of exploitation, and it all started because Columbus stepped ashore, saw generosity, and thought, "This is mine now." So you've crossed the Atlantic in rickety ships, mistakenly discovered a land you're convinced is Asia, and annoyed or baffled the locals with your endless gold hunting. What's next on the Columbus checklist? That's right, a catastrophic shipwreck, a settlement that would make even the most dysfunctional HOA look organized, and a return to Spain with a sales pitch worthy of a timeshare hawker. Let's set the scene. It's Christmas Eve, 1492. Columbus and his men are sailing along the coast of what's now Hispaniola, modern Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Spirits were probably high, or at least moderately drunk, because the wine rations were flowing. But here's where Columbus's lax leadership came back to bite him. He left the Santa Maria, his largest ship, his pride and joy, under the command of a steersman who promptly decided that Christmas was a fine time for a nap. Yep, the man at the wheel fell asleep. The ship drifted, the currents took control, and crunch. The Santa Maria ran aground on a reef. Now Columbus wasn't exactly thrilled. The ship was beyond saving. His men worked through the night, frantically trying to lighten the load and salvage what they could. Cannons, supplies, cargo, all hauled ashore or left to the mercy of the waves. By morning, the Santa Maria was a wreck, her splintered frame half submerged like a tragic maritime tombstone. And this wasn't just a bad day at sea. Losing the Santa Maria meant Columbus had fewer ships, fewer supplies, and a real logistical mess on his hands. But Columbus, ever the glass half full guy, even when that glass was filled with seawater, decided to spin disaster into opportunity. Stranded with limited options, he ordered his men to use the timbers of the ruined Santa Maria to build a fort, and thus the settlement of La Navidad was born. The name, meaning the nativity, was a nod to the date of the wreck, but considering what followed, they probably should have named it La Terrible Idea. La Navidad was in theory a foothold for Spain in this new land. Columbus left behind about 39 men, a mix of volunteers, And let's face it, guys he probably didn't want on his return voyage. Their mission? Find gold, keep the peace with the locals, hold down the fort, literally, until Columbus could come back with reinforcements and supplies. What could go wrong? Well, everything. For starters, La Navidad was built in a hurry, and wasn't exactly fortified like a proper European settlement. It was more like a wooden fort with big dreams. Columbus trusted that his men could coexist with the Taino people. You know, those same locals. His crew had already started to irritate with their demands, arrogance, and casual looting. He gave the departing men strict orders to behave, no stealing, no assaulting the locals, no stirring up trouble. It was a nice idea, but expecting discipline from this crew was like expecting a raccoon not to tip over your trash can. Leaving La Navidad behind, Columbus set sail for Spain in early 1493. The return journey wasn't easy. Storms battered his ships, including one nasty gale that nearly sent him to the bottom of the Atlantic. But miraculously, he made it. And when he landed back in Spain, Columbus played it cool, like he'd just pulled off the greatest heist in history. Picture it. Columbus arriving at court, proudly parading a small but eye-catching selection of proof that his mission had been a roaring success. He had a few gold trinkets, nothing like the mountains of riches he'd promised, but shiny enough to impress. He had parrots, colourful and exotic, squawking their way into the royal chambers like feathered PR agents. And of course, he had a handful of Taino captives, brought as ambassadors, red human trophies, to show off his achievements and the potential for future conversions to Christianity. It was like showing up to a royal investor meeting with a sad PowerPoint, but with live animals and confused human beings instead of pie charts. Ferdinand and Isabella were dazzled. Gold, parrots, new lands for the taking. This was everything they'd hoped for. The fact that Columbus had slightly overpromised on the riches and the whole Asia thing, minor detail. They granted him more ships, more men, and more funding for another voyage. Columbus was a hero, a visionary, a man who had crossed the ocean and come back with wonders, and conveniently downplayed the whole lost a ship and maybe left a doomed colony behind part. Back on Hispaniola, meanwhile, La Navidad was falling apart faster than Columbus could polish his medals. The men left behind didn't stick to his be nice orders. They fought among themselves, stole from the Taino, took women as they pleased, and generally acted like the worst kind of guests. Unsurprisingly, the Taino, who'd initially welcomed these strange visitors, had enough. By the time Columbus returned on his second voyage, La Navidad was gone, burned to the ground, its garrison dead. Columbus's grand experiment in colonization had lasted less time than a bad reality show. So to recap, Columbus wrecked his flagship, built a doomed settlement, and somehow still managed to return home to a hero's welcome. Why? Because, as he proved time and again, if you wave a shiny parrot around and say the word gold enough times, people will overlook a lot of bad ideas. You'd think, after one disastrous voyage, losing a flagship, founding a settlement that burned to the ground, and returning home with more parrots than gold, Columbus might have decided to hang up his compass and retire somewhere quiet. But no, not our Christopher. If anything, the man doubled down. He was convinced that just over the next wave, just beyond the next island, lay the treasures he'd promised Spain. The result? 3 more voyages, each messier and more disappointing than the last. A downward spiral of storms, rebellion, mismanagement, and finally, chains. Let's start with the second voyage, 1493 to 1496. This time, Columbus didn't just have 3 leaky ships and a dream. No, this time he had a fleet. 17 ships and over 1,000 men. Soldiers, settlers, priests, craftsmen, and opportunists, looking to strike it rich. It was less an expedition and more a floating city. Spain had seen Columbus's first haul, tiny though it was, and was now all in on this new world scheme. Surely this time there would be gold, spices, silk, something to justify the expense. But from the moment Columbus arrived back in the Caribbean, things began to go wrong. First, he found La Navidad in ruins. His original settlement wiped out, his men killed, likely due to their own bad behavior, but Columbus chose to blame the locals entirely. So, undeterred, he founded a new town, La Isabela, named for Queen Isabella. This was supposed to be a proper colony. the crown jewel of Spain's overseas empire. In reality, La Isabela was a swampy, poorly chosen site that was a nightmare of disease, hunger, and infighting. The settlers quarreled, the food spoiled, and morale sank lower than a leaky rowboat. Columbus's leadership didn't help. His talents lay in daring navigation, not in keeping unruly colonists in line, or managing food supplies, or setting up a government. He demanded loyalty but offered little vision beyond find gold. His rule became increasingly harsh. He imposed brutal punishments on both settlers and indigenous people. Floggings, executions, forced labor, all became part of daily life, as Columbus tried to control a crumbling colony while still chasing his dream of vast riches. And about that gold, the mountains of wealth he'd promised were nowhere to be found. Instead, the settlers were sent off on wild goose chases, digging where Columbus insisted treasure must be, and coming up empty. The third voyage, 1498 to 1500, started with a glimmer of hope. Columbus explored parts of South America. He even became the first European to see the continent's mainland, near what's now Venezuela. For a brief moment, he thought he'd finally hit the jackpot. The Orinoco River was so vast that Columbus convinced himself it must flow from the Garden of Eden. Yes, he actually wrote that. But Eden didn't seem to have much gold either, and whatever satisfaction he got from this geographical discovery was short-lived. Back at Hispaniola, things were a disaster. Rebellions had broken out, both among the Spaniards sick of Columbus's rule and the indigenous people resisting Spanish cruelty. Even Columbus's brothers, who were supposed to help him govern, managed to alienate just about everyone. The once idolized admiral of the ocean sea had become, in the eyes of many, a tyrant. Reports of his brutality, floggings, mutilations, mass hangings, reached Spain, and while the crown was all for converting and civilizing new lands, they didn't want their colonies collapsing in chaos. So in 1500, Spain sent a new governor, Francisco de Bobadilla, to take over. Bobadilla didn't mess around. He arrested Columbus and his brothers, put them in irons, and shipped them back to Spain like common criminals. Picture it: Columbus, the great explorer, in chains, hauled across the Atlantic like a disgraced pirate. And the worst part? He reportedly insisted on wearing the chains even when offered the chance to remove them, as a sort of martyr's badge, a man of flair to the end. You'd think that would be the end of Columbus's career. But no, the Spanish monarchs, while disappointed, weren't ready to give up entirely. They freed him, but stripped him of his titles and power. Still, Columbus convinced them to give him one last shot. Enter the fourth voyage, 1502 to 1504. By now Columbus was older, sicker, and increasingly desperate. This was supposed to be the grand finale, the voyage that would finally find the passage to Asia he had always sought. Instead, it turned into 2 years of shipwrecks, storms, and misery. Columbus explored parts of Central America, convinced he was close to the riches of the East. He got caught in hurricanes that battered his ships, his men mutinied, supplies ran low, and at one point he and his crew were stranded for a year on Jamaica, relying on trickery like predicting a lunar eclipse to awe the locals just to stay alive. By the time Columbus limped home in 1504, his reputation was in tatters, his dreams of wealth and empire dashed. He died just 2 years later, still convinced he'd found a new route to Asia, never fully grasping that he'd stumbled upon an entirely new continent. So yes, Columbus could sail, no question. But as a governor, as a colony builder, as a man of vision and compassion, let's just say the chains he returned in felt a little too fitting. When Christopher Columbus died in 1506, he probably thought history would remember him as the man who found the western route to Asia, the daring admiral of the ocean sea, who unlocked untold riches and glory for Europe. Well, history remembered him. All right, just not quite like that. Instead of being the guy who brought back spices and silk, Columbus became the man who cracked open the door to centuries of conquest, colonization, and catastrophe. And it all started because he made a giant wrong turn and refused to admit it. Let's talk about what followed in the wake of Columbus's voyages. The thing historians call the Columbian Exchange. Sounds friendly, like some kind of international gift swap. In reality, it was more like a giant chaotic trade fair that nobody signed up for, with consequences that would reshape the world. Suddenly, plants, animals, people, and diseases started crisscrossing the Atlantic in ways that would make a modern customs official weep. First up, plants and crops. Columbus's misadventure kicked off a global food revolution. Europe got its hands on treasures like potatoes, tomatoes, corn, and cacao, which means, yes, Columbus indirectly made your French fries, pizza sauce, and chocolate bar possible. Imagine the first European biting into a tomato and wondering if it was edible or a shiny red death ball. On the flip side, the Americas got wheat, sugarcane, coffee, and citrus. Sounds tasty, but they also got weeds and invasive species that choked out native plants. So thanks, Chris. Then there were the animals. Europeans brought horses, pigs, cattle, and sheep, and unleashed them on lands that had never seen such creatures. To indigenous people, horses were game changers, transforming hunting, travel, and warfare. But pigs, oh, pigs were a disaster. Let loose, they tore through fields, wrecked gardens, and spread faster than gossip in a small town. Imagine watching your carefully tended crops get eaten by what must have seemed like the world's rudest, hungriest invaders. But the biggest and most tragic part of the Columbian exchange wasn't what people planted or ate, it was what they caught. Diseases like smallpox, measles, influenza, and typhus hitched rides on European ships and tore through indigenous populations with horrifying speed. We're talking about epidemics that wiped out entire communities. In some areas, up to 90% of the native population perished within decades of first contact. Whole cultures, languages, and ways of life vanished. Not because of battles or conquest, at least not at first, but because invisible killers arrived in the breath of strangers. And then there's the other legacy Columbus didn't intend, but absolutely unleashed: European colonization and exploitation. Once word got out that there was land across the sea, land that looked ripe for the taking, filled with resources and vulnerable peoples, the European powers couldn't resist. Spain, Portugal, England, France, the Netherlands, they all wanted in on the action. Gold, silver, sugar, spices, and later, slaves, fueled a frenzy of empire building that would reshape continents. Columbus might not have personally designed the brutal systems that followed: the plantation economies, the Atlantic slave trade, the forced conversions, and cultural erasure, but he lit the match. His bumbling reports of vast riches and easy pickings sent wave after wave of adventurers, conquistadors, and colonists scrambling west. The result? Centuries of colonial rule, extraction of wealth, and violent subjugation of indigenous peoples. From the Aztecs and Incas in the south, to the Powhatan and Iroquois in the north, no one was safe from Europe's New World fever. And let's not forget the human cost beyond the Americas. Columbus's legacy helped build the demand for slave labor that would see millions of Africans torn from their homes and shipped across the Atlantic in chains. The sugar plantations of the Caribbean, the silver mines of Peru, the tobacco fields of Virginia, all fed on the backs of enslaved peoples, all part of the engine of empire that Columbus had jump-started. So yes, Columbus didn't find Asia, but what he did find opened the floodgates for one of the most transformative and destructive periods in world history. His voyages rewired global trade, reshaped diets, redrew maps, and set the stage for empires and economies that would dominate the world for centuries. And all because a Genoese sailor thought he could shortcut his way to spices and silk. Today, we look back on Columbus with a mix of awe, horror, and a whole lot of awkwardness. Statues topple, holidays are reconsidered, and people debate whether he was a hero, a villain, or just a really determined, really misguided man in a funny hat. What's undeniable is this: he changed the world, not because he knew what he was doing, but because he didn't. So here's to Columbus, the man who by getting lost, helped everyone else find a new world. Too bad what they did with it was, let's say, less than ideal. So let's recap. Columbus spent his life chasing a shortcut that didn't exist, got hopelessly lost, stumbled upon a land he didn't understand, ran colonies like a tyrant, and died still convinced he'd found Asia. So how did this guy, a man who'd probably lose at a modern geography B to a fifth grader, become one of the most mythologized figures in Western history? How did his name end up on cities, rivers, holidays, and far too many statues? Welcome to the fascinating world of historical PR, where facts are optional and legends get built on wishful thinking. The birth of a legend. America wanted a hero. Any hero would do for centuries after his death. Columbus wasn't exactly a household name. Sure, educated Europeans knew who he was, but he wasn't seen as some larger-than-life figure. He was just one of many explorers who helped Europe muscle its way into the Americas. No statues, no parades, no people naming their kids Christopher in his honor. That all started to change in the 18th and 19th centuries, especially in the United States. By then, the young US was desperate for national heroes. The country wanted figures who weren't tied to the British monarchy, and who could symbolize boldness, courage, and the spirit of discovery. George Washington could only do so much heavy lifting. Enter Columbus, a European adventurer who discovered a whole new world. Never mind that it wasn't new to the people who already lived there. Columbus was recast as the ultimate symbol of brave exploration, the man who set the stage for the American experiment. Writers and poets got busy painting Columbus as a visionary hero. In 1828, Washington Irving, yes, the guy who wrote The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, published a romanticized biography of Columbus that turned him into a near saint. Irving's book downplayed the failures, the cruelty, and the constant geographic confusion, and focused instead on a man of unshakable faith who overcame doubters to change the world. It was historical fiction disguised as fact, and boy did people eat it up. Columbus Day. A holiday built on myth. By the late 19th century, Columbus was so enshrined in the American imagination that the US government decided he deserved his own holiday. Columbus Day was first officially celebrated in 1892, marking the 400th anniversary of his landing. The timing wasn't accidental. America was going through waves of immigration, particularly from Italy, and Columbus, an Italian, became a convenient bridge figure, someone Italian Americans could point to as proof they too had deep roots in the American story. Parades, speeches, and eventually a federal holiday followed. Columbus became less a real person and more a national mascot, someone who, according to the storybook version, brought civilization, faith, and progress to a wild, empty continent. It was neat, tidy, and utterly divorced from reality. The statues, chiseling a myth in stone. Fast forward to the 20th century. Across the US, and even parts of Latin America and Europe, cities and towns put up statues of Columbus. You'll find him everywhere, standing heroically on ships, gazing boldly westward, holding a cross or a royal banner. Never mind that the real Columbus was more likely clutching a tattered map and wondering why Asia had so many parrots. These monuments weren't about history. They were about identity politics. They served to honor European heritage, to reinforce certain narratives of discovery, and to provide immigrant communities, especially Italians, with a sense of pride in their contribution to the New World. Modern re-evaluation. The fall of a legend. Of course, myths don't last forever, especially in an age when people start asking uncomfortable questions. In recent decades, Columbus's reputation has taken a nosedive. Historians, and frankly, anyone with access to a decent library or Google, have highlighted the parts of the Columbus story that got left out of the holiday speeches: the enslavement, the brutality, the incompetence. Indigenous activists and scholars have rightly pointed out that Columbus didn't discover anything. He arrived uninvited, brought devastation, and opened the floodgates for centuries of colonialism. That re-evaluation has played out in public spaces. Statues of Columbus have been vandalized, removed, or toppled. Cities like Los Angeles, Minneapolis, and Seattle have replaced Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day, shifting the focus from a mythic explorer to the people who were here long before his ships appeared on the horizon. What was once unchallenged celebration is now an ongoing heated debate about history, memory, and who gets honored, the punchline of the myth. So here we are, centuries later, still arguing about a guy who thought Cuba might be Japan. Somehow, Columbus became the man with cities, rivers, and holidays named after him. A man whose actual deeds, when you strip away the PR, were often disastrous. If history teaches us anything, it's that facts don't always win the day. Sometimes, all it takes is a good story, some well-placed statues, and a few generations willing to look the other way. And Columbus? He may not have found Asia, but he sure found his way into the heart of a myth, one we're only now starting to untangle.